History is filled with rulers who left their mark on the world, but only a few carved their legacy so deeply and so brutally that their names survive not as mere memories, but as shadows that stretch across entire centuries. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of those shadows, a figure shaped by war, betrayal, shifting empires, and a homeland constantly fighting for its existence. A figure remembered not only for the throne he struggled to hold, but for the fear he wielded with unwavering precision. A man whose real story is far more complex, far more human, and far more chilling than the legends that followed him. Before he was known as the Impaler, before the world attached his name to darkness and myth, he was a prince born into a land caught between giants, Wallachia, surrounded by the relentless rise of the Ottoman Empire on one side, and the strategic ambitions of the Kingdom of Hungary on the other, was a place where peace was rare, where survival demanded harsh decisions, and where power could vanish as quickly as winter light. It was a land where loyalty shifted like wind over the Carpathians, a land where a ruler had two choices: command absolute authority, or be swallowed by those who did. And it was in this unforgiving world that Vlad III's legend began. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene, because the story ahead isn't merely about brutality, it's about the forces that created it. It's about a childhood spent as a hostage deep within the Ottoman court, about a homeland drowning in corruption and betrayal, about a ruler determined to forge order through fear, discipline, and methods that still horrify the world centuries later. And it's about how these real events, documented, recorded, witnessed, slowly transformed into the mythic image of Dracula, a figure more rooted in political propaganda than supernatural fantasy. Tonight, we'll peel back those layers, one by one. We'll walk through forests where Impalement was not legend but reality. We'll explore the tension of empires, the shifting loyalties of noble families, and the moments where truth and myth began to blur. This is the world that shaped Vlad the Impaler. This is where the story truly begins. The first light of dawn over 15th century Wallachia was not a sudden burst of brightness but a slow, almost hesitant unfolding of color across a land shaped by centuries of tension. As the sun moved gradually over the ridges of the southern Carpathians, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their outlines softened by layers of drifting mist that clung to the slopes. Shadows retreated with reluctance, withdrawing into forests so dense that even experienced travelers hesitated before entering them. These forests, vast, old, and silent, were not simply part of the landscape. They were part of Wallachia's identity, stretching across valleys, hills, and lowlands, carrying within them the echoes of generations who had survived under their cover. The air in these early hours carried the familiar sense of damp soil, resin from pine and fir, and occasionally the faint aroma of smoke rising from distant villages. Life here began quietly, not with hurried footsteps or clamor, but with the soft, steady motions of people accustomed to both hardship and routine. Farmers stepped onto the cold ground before sunrise, their breath small clouds drifting into the air. Shepherds prepared to lead their flocks into the high pastures. Fishermen at riverbanks checked nets stretched across the slow waters of the Argi, Dambovica, and Olt rivers, lifelines that wound like silver threads through the region. Wallachia, during the early 1400s, was not a kingdom of wealth or grandeur. It was a principality shaped by necessity, positioned between immense powers that forced it into a state of constant vigilance. To the south lay the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire, under leaders whose ambitions stretched beyond the horizon. To the north and west stood the Kingdom of Hungary, a Christian power with its own complex political currents. Wallachia existed between these forces, like a fragile vessel caught between two vast tides, needing to survive, to endure, and to navigate carefully without capsizing. The land itself was divided into three main regions: Muntenia, Oltenia, and parts of what historians later called southern Moldavia, but all shared the same underlying reality: vulnerability. Yet, this vulnerability bred resilience. Across Wallachia's plains, which shifted from thick forests to open farmland and back again, villages were built with practicality in mind. Wooden homes with steep roofs stood close enough for communal protection, but far enough to allow families their own modest space. Churches, usually constructed of stone, served not only spiritual purposes, but acted as strongholds in times of uncertainty. In the courts of Wallachian rulers, life moved according to another rhythm, one shaped not by day-to-day labor, but by diplomacy, alliances, and the perpetual balancing act between submission and resistance. The voivode, the ruling prince, held authority over the boyars, the noble families whose support determined political stability. Yet the boyars, with their estates spread across the region, had their own ambitions, their own loyalties, and their own histories of betrayal and shifting alliances. Rulers rose and fell quickly. The throne of Wallachia had never been a place of comfort. It was within this world, one defined by fragile borders and shifting senses of loyalty, that a deeper, older culture continued to thrive. Folk songs sung in slow, echoing tones carried the memories of past battles, heroic figures, and tragedies that blended fact with legend. Storytellers spoke of supernatural beings inhabiting the forests, spirits that watched over or tormented travelers depending on their actions. These tales were more than entertainment. They reflected the land's character, its mystique, and the uncertainties that shaped the daily experiences of its people. Even the Orthodox Church, with its monasteries and traditional rituals, blended into this cultural fabric, offering stability where politics could not. The economy of Wallachia, while modest, was shaped by resources the land provided: grain grown in the fertile plains, livestock raised in the foothills, honey and wax collected from forest hives, and salt mined from ancient deposits. The principality also sat along important trade routes, connecting the Balkans to Central Europe. Caravans passed through its territories, carrying goods, news, and rumors from far beyond the region. Yet, these same routes brought armies, spies, envoys, and conflicts, making Wallachia a corridor through which larger powers exerted their influence. Life under these conditions instilled a certain cautious steadiness in Wallachia's people. They understood the unpredictability of external rule and internal division. They knew that an alliance one season could become a conflict the next. They knew that a voivode who showed strength might hold the throne, while one who hesitated could lose everything. And they knew that survival required adaptation, sometimes loyalty, sometimes resistance, sometimes the difficult act of appearing to serve two masters. As dawn broadened across the horizon, revealing fields of barley, patches of wheat, orchards of plum and apple trees, and the narrow dirt roads connecting settlements, the land appeared peaceful. Yet beneath this appearance lay the accumulation of centuries of political pressure. The Ottoman Empire, already powerful in the early 15th century, watched Wallachia closely, expecting tribute and obedience. Hungary, similarly, expected loyalty, and saw Wallachia as a strategic buffer preventing Ottoman advancement deeper into Central Europe. This delicate positioning would eventually become the backdrop of countless struggles, military, political, and personal. To outsiders, Wallachia might have seemed like a remote, obscure principality, but to its inhabitants, it was a land of immense weight, a place where every decision mattered and where the presence of larger forces was never far away. It was not unusual for news of an Ottoman campaign or Hungarian intrigue to reach even the smallest villages, carried by messengers, monks, or traveling merchants. The people lived not only in their own time, but in the shadow of events unfolding across the wider world. And it was into this environment, shaped by caution, vigilance, hardship, and a deep-rooted cultural identity, that Vlad III would eventually be born. The land he would come to rule was already steeped in tension. The forests, rivers, mountains, and people carried within them the weight of centuries, and the political landscape into which he would emerge was already set on a trajectory of struggle between the great powers surrounding Wallachia. The dawn that rose over the principality each morning was more than a cycle of light. It was a reminder of the fragile equilibrium upon which Wallachia survived. As the mist lifted fully and the first sounds of daily life spread across the land, tools striking soil, livestock stirring, merchants preparing their goods, the threads of Wallachian society wove themselves into another day. And somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were already shifting, alliances forming and breaking, decisions being made by rulers whose ambitions would soon shape the life of the child who would one day become Vlad the Impaler. His story could not be separated from the land, because the land itself was the foundation that shaped every choice he would make. And so, as this dawn settles into day, the story begins to move quietly toward the circumstances of his birth, where the currents of politics and lineage converge to create a life marked by both power and peril. The shifting landscape of Wallachia in the early 15th century formed a cradle shaped not by comfort, but by the relentless tremors of political uncertainty. As the region drifted between the ambitions of greater powers and the ambitions of lesser men, a new life entered this uneasy world, born not into serenity, but into a dynasty where survival was neither inherent nor assured. The House of Dracula, a branch of the ancient Basarab dynasty, carried within its lineage the weight of old bloodlines and the burden of constant challenge. To be born of this house meant inheriting expectations fashioned from both glory and danger, a mixture that would define the life of Vlad III long before he took his first steps upon the soil of his homeland. When Vlad was born in 1431, likely in the Transylvanian city of Sighișoara, where his father resided at the time, the world around him was already shaped by a delicate balance of alliances and threats. His father, Vlad II, bore a title far more symbolic than royal, the name Dracula. Derived from his membership in the prestigious Order of the Dragon, the title represented not only a connection to chivalric vows and noble intent, but also a pledge to defend Christendom from the advancing Ottoman Empire. The order, founded by King Sigismund of Hungary, sought to gather the most loyal and capable princes and knights in a unified effort to resist Ottoman expansion into Europe. For Vlad II, the title was a mark of honor, yet within Wallachia it had deeper echoes, ones that would later influence the identity of his son and the legends that surrounded him. Wallachia itself was a principality caught between the influence of Hungary to the northwest and the rapidly growing Ottoman Empire to the south and east. Its rulers rarely governed without contestation. The throne of Wallachia was not determined by smooth succession but by the competition of claimants, often backed by more powerful neighbors who expected loyalty in exchange for support. In such a climate, even a prince who held the throne could never be sure of tomorrow's certainty. Alliances shifted as frequently as the wind across the plains, and each new ruler entered into a landscape where betrayal and rebellion existed as naturally as riverbanks and forests. Into this world, Vlad III's birth represented another link in the chain of dynastic continuity. Yet, unlike some heirs born into kingdoms with clear lines of succession and institutional stability, he entered a realm where power was immediately contested and life shaped by tension. His father was already navigating a fragile position among rival boyar families, neighboring principalities, and the distant oversight of powerful kings and sultans. The political air surrounding his birth could not have been anything but heavy, the atmosphere charged with the obligations and dangers that accompanied his lineage. The House of Dracula, although historically significant, was only one side of the Basarab family, and its right to rule Wallachia was constantly challenged by the rival dynasty line. Their conflict was not merely political, but entwined with regional loyalties, familial grudges, and old grievances carried by noble families who saw themselves as guardians of Wallachian heritage. Young Vlad, though unaware of it, was from birth a participant in this ongoing contest. His identity as a Draculist prince connected him to a lineage expected to assert strength, resilience, and unwavering authority, qualities that the political environment demanded from rulers who wished to survive. His father's position in the Order of the Dragon added another dimension. The Order's symbol, a coiled dragon encircling a cross, would shape the identity of Vlad II and eventually influence the moniker attached to his son. While the father became known as Dracula, a term derived from Draco, meaning dragon, the son would later be called Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. In the centuries that followed, the word would take on darker, more mythical interpretations, yet in its original context, it signified lineage, honor, and duty. It represented a connection to a military and political alliance oriented toward protection, an ironic detail when considering the brutal reputation Vlad III would come to inhabit. During Vlad's earliest years, the region was marked by the aftermath of conflicts, fragile truces, and the constant movement of soldiers across the borders. The Ottoman Empire was expanding, its influence spreading steadily across the Balkans, while Hungary continued to serve as a bulwark against this encroachment. Wallachia lay between them like a narrow gate, its rulers forced to choose alliances carefully, shifting allegiances depending on which force posed the more immediate threat. Such choices were rarely straightforward, and they often led to outcomes that upended the political order. Vlad II himself faced such decisions, navigating between paying tribute to the Ottomans for peace and supporting the Hungarian crown in its defensive efforts. These decisions were not made freely, but under the pressure of survival, for Wallachia lacked the military strength to stand independent of both great powers. The young Vlad III grew up in a family conditioned by such uncertainties, where each gesture toward diplomacy carried consequences, and each pledge left potential openings for resentment or retribution. In the early years of Vlad's life, his father's shifting alliances created an atmosphere where instability was not only political but deeply personal. When Vlad II received support from the Ottomans, it added tension to his relationship with Hungary. When he favored Hungary, it led to conflict with the Ottomans. This precarious balancing act defined the household in which Vlad and his brothers were raised. Their childhood, though noble in appearance, was shaped by the underlying awareness that their father's decisions placed the family at constant risk of danger, either from foreign powers or from internal rivals. The tension of ruling Wallachia seeped into every aspect of life within the princely household. The children of the Draculisti dynasty grew up listening not merely to tales of honor or heritage, but to whispers of conspiracy, movements of troops, the agitation of boyars, and the ever-present possibility of betrayal. Even the architecture of their environment reflected this atmosphere: fortified structures, thick walls, and watchtowers designed for vigilance rather than comfort. These were not homes meant for peace, but for defense, a fact that left subtle impressions on a young mind absorbing the world around him. As Vlad III moved through early childhood, he was surrounded not only by the tangible signs of instability, but also by the more profound cultural elements of Wallachia. The principality carried layers of traditions, Orthodox Christian rituals, folklore filled with spirits and omens, and stories woven from the struggles of the past. These influences shaped the spiritual and cultural environment in which he developed, merging religious devotion with a sense of destiny tied to his lineage. The expectations placed upon him were not only political but intrinsic to the identity of the land, where rulers were seen as guardians of both faith and homeland. Even in these earliest years, the foundation of Vlad's future was being laid, not through direct action but through the gradual shaping of his inner world by the turbulence surrounding him. The dynasty into which he was born was one forged by conflict, its survival tied to the strength and decisiveness of its leaders. As the boy observed the behaviors of those around him, his father's careful negotiations, the guarded movements of soldiers, the watchfulness of attendants, he absorbed lessons that would later manifest in the harsh methods he would employ as a ruler. Thus, the birth of Vlad III within this turbulent dynasty was not merely an event, but the beginning of a life forged by the pressures and expectations of his lineage. Each element, the prestige of the Order of the Dragon, the fragile politics of Wallachia, the rivalry of noble houses, the looming presence of the Ottomans, and the ever-present need for strength, created a setting in which a child destined for severity and resolve could emerge. His early existence was intertwined with the instability of his father's reign, the dangers of regional power dynamics, and the heritage of a family accustomed to the burdens of rule. And so, as Vlad's childhood began to unfold within this volatile environment, the forces that shaped him were already gathering, forming the contours of a personality forged in the fires of political pressure and the demands of dynastic survival. This environment would soon push him further into experiences that would leave indelible marks on his character, as the events that followed his early years drew him deeper into the complexities of Wallachian politics and the dangerous world beyond its borders. The quiet lessons of Wallachian politics and the heavy expectations of the Draculichti lineage were soon overshadowed by a far harsher education, one that would not be delivered in the familiar stone halls of his homeland, but within the austere walls of the Ottoman Empire. Vlad III, still a boy in the early 1440s, and his younger brother Radu, were sent as political hostages to Constantinople, a measure intended to ensure the loyalty of their father, Vlad II Dracula, to the Ottoman Sultan. The decision, though standard for the era and recognized as a method of maintaining peace between vassal and overlord, carried consequences that were far-reaching, affecting the temperament, worldview, and even the eventual methods of governance that Vlad would employ as prince. To understand the formative years of Vlad the Impaler, it is essential to consider not only the physical circumstances of his captivity, but the psychological, ideological, and cultural pressures that shaped him in ways both subtle and profound. Wallachia's position between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire made it a principal vassal state whose allegiance was constantly tested. For a ruler like Vlad II, sending his sons to the Ottoman court was a necessary act of diplomacy, a tangible guarantee that his principality would not resist Ottoman demands. But for Vlad and Radu, the experience was anything but diplomatic. They were removed from the familiar sounds of Wallachian forests, the routines of village life, and the gentle rhythms of the valleys they had known since birth. Instead, they were immersed in a world that was both vast and alien, a city of stone and water, where the call of the muezzin floated over marble streets and imperial banners marked the power of a sultan whose reach extended across the Balkans. The daily life of a hostage prince in Constantinople was regimented and often isolating. The children were closely monitored by attendants loyal to the Ottoman administration, their movements controlled and their education shaped by the customs of the imperial court. Despite their noble birth, they were required to adopt a demeanor of humility and obedience, participating in exercises designed to reinforce loyalty and to cultivate a sense of respect, or in some cases fear, toward the ruling sultan. Their studies included not only reading, writing, and religion, but also military training, administration, and the lessons of diplomacy, all framed by the ideological worldview of the Ottomans. Here the young princes learned not only the mechanics of power but the subtler art of survival under conditions where disobedience could bring swift and irrevocable consequences. For Vlad, these years would be formative in shaping both his mental discipline and his emotional detachment. Isolated from his family and homeland, he witnessed firsthand the disparities between power and vulnerability. His companions included other sons of vassals, a mix of children whose families had likewise submitted to the Sultan's demands. While some were allowed to mingle freely, forming bonds that would last into adulthood, Vlad's personality was molded by the awareness that any misstep, whether a spoken word, a gesture, or even a fleeting display of weakness, could be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty. It was a world where observation was constant, and where even the minutest error could reverberate through years of delicate negotiation. At the Ottoman court, the children were exposed to a culture and a political system markedly different from Wallachia. They observed the Sultan's authority exercised with absolute control, a hierarchical order where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished without mercy. Military discipline was pervasive, from the training of elite janissaries to the organization of courtly ceremonies. Vlad, witnessing these displays of power, absorbed lessons in both the mechanisms of fear and the projection of authority, while his brother Radu would later embrace the Ottoman perspective, integrating into its structures with apparent ease. Vlad internalized a different understanding that power could be maintained not only through loyalty or diplomacy, but also through fear, precision, and the uncompromising application of rules. The psychological pressure of captivity left its mark in ways that were invisible yet indelible. The boys were separated from their familiar support systems, and their identities were constantly tested against the expectations of their captors. Meals, schooling, and religious instruction became both routine and subtle instruments of indoctrination. The princes were taught to negotiate their own survival, to read the intentions of those around them, and to anticipate threats before they manifested. These were lessons of observation, calculation, and emotional restraint, and they laid the foundation for Vlad's later methods of ruling with unyielding discipline. In addition to the rigid routines of daily life, there were moments when the stark contrast between home and captivity became unavoidable. Letters from Wallachia, rare as they were, reminded Vlad of the world beyond the empire's walls, the forests, rivers, and villages that seemed now like distant memories. These reminders, combined with the pressure of imperial oversight, created a psychological tension, the longing for homeland intertwined with the necessity of obedience. Such tension, maintained over years, nurtured a capacity for emotional control and an early understanding of the fragility of power. Vlad was learning, in effect, that security and authority were inseparable from vigilance, suspicion, and the willingness to act decisively. The ideological framework of the Ottoman court further shaped Vlad's early understanding of authority. He observed the integration of religion and politics, the ceremonial displays of loyalty, and the consequences faced by those who failed to adhere to prescribed roles. While his education included exposure to Islam as practiced in the empire, it also underscored the universality of hierarchical control. Those who held power expected absolute recognition and swift enforcement of obedience. For a child who would later become a voivode of Wallachia, these lessons provided both a model and a cautionary tale. They demonstrated that rule could not depend solely on tradition or familial right. It demanded strategy, rigor, and when necessary, cruelty. Despite the challenges, Vlad's time in Ottoman captivity was not without structure or guidance. Tutors and attendants provided instruction in literacy, numeracy, and the principles of governance, even as they reminded him continuously of his position as a hostage. Exercises in martial skills and horseback riding introduced him to both the physical demands of leadership and the discipline required to command respect. These activities, though framed as preparation for a future role within Wallachia, were conducted under the omnipresent shadow of Ottoman authority, constantly reinforcing the association between power and constraint. Over the years of captivity, Vlad and his brother Radu grew in markedly different ways. Radu's disposition leaned toward adaptation, toward integration within the Ottoman framework, and toward forming alliances that would ensure his personal security. Vlad's temperament, however, hardened under the same conditions. The combination of isolation, observation, ideological immersion, and constant awareness of potential threat cultivated in him a severity of character that would later manifest in his legendary cruelty. He learned to internalize fear, to control impulses, and to project authority that was both meticulous and formidable. This emotional discipline, forged in the austere environment of Constantinople, would shape not only his personal interactions but the very methods by which he would rule his principality. In these formative years, Vlad's identity became entwined with the tension between submission and sovereignty, between loyalty and survival. The lessons of captivity, the observation of power, the imposition of order, the constant evaluation of threat prepared him for the complex and often brutal life that awaited upon his return to Wallachia. Every day within the Ottoman court contributed to a mental architecture built upon caution, strategy, and control. By the time he left the empire, he had internalized a worldview in which authority was inseparable from fear and discipline, and in which mercy could be treated as a luxury rarely afforded to those who sought to maintain dominion. And so, as Vlad III and Radu eventually returned toward the land of their birth, The lessons of their years as hostages lingered like shadows along every road, forest, and riverbank they encountered. The forests of Wallachia, the fortified towns, and the political structures that once seemed familiar now took on new dimensions, filtered through the perspective of children who had lived under the watchful eyes of an empire. Vlad's temperament, already marked by the pressures of his family and dynasty, had been tempered further by exposure to an empire that demanded obedience and rewarded only vigilance and strategy. This dual inheritance from his lineage and from captivity would form the cornerstone of his methods as a ruler, setting the stage for both his administration and the infamous measures for which he would become known. Thus, the quiet valleys and mountains of Wallachia waited for the return of a boy whose early experiences had already distinguished him from his peers. The land he had once known as home would now be observed through a lens sharpened by years of confinement, discipline, and the constant presence of authority. Vlad III was no longer merely a child of a turbulent dynasty. He was a product of two worlds, each shaping his mind, his emotions, and the methods by which he would one day assert control over both his people and his enemies. And as the brothers crossed back into Wallachia, the stage was set for the next chapter of their lives, a chapter defined not by captivity but by the demands of a principality perched precariously between empires, where allegiance and power were never certain, and where survival would require every lesson they had learned during their years as hostages. Returning to Wallachia after years spent as hostages under the watchful eyes of the Ottoman court, Vlad III and his brother Radu encountered a homeland that was both familiar and altered by the ever-present forces of external power. The landscape they had once known, the mist-laden forests, the winding rivers, the valleys nestled between the Carpathian ridges, remained unchanged in appearance, but the political currents beneath its surface were far more complex, far more volatile. Wallachia existed not as an independent entity but as a principality perpetually caught between two immense powers, the Kingdom of Hungary to the northwest and the Ottoman Empire to the south. Both powers cast long shadows over its rulers, compelling them to negotiate their survival with delicate skill, while the internal landscape of boyars and rival claimants added layers of unpredictability to an already precarious situation. To understand the pressures that Vlad III would later navigate as a ruler, it is necessary to consider the geopolitical reality of 15th century Wallachia. Hungary, under a succession of capable monarchs, sought to exert influence over its southern neighbour as a buffer against Ottoman expansion. The Hungarian crown demanded loyalty, tribute, and military support, yet could not guarantee protection against the empire that was steadily growing to the south. On the other side, the Ottomans, expanding after the fall of Constantinople and firmly establishing their dominance over the Balkans, treated Wallachia as a vassal state. Their demands were explicit: tribute in gold, military support when called upon, and the assurance that Wallachia would not serve as a staging ground for opposition. The principality, positioned geographically as the gate between East and West, became a delicate instrument through which the ambitions of far larger powers were projected. Within this context, loyalty became a fluid concept, dependent less on personal virtue than on strategic survival. A Wallachian ruler's decision to side with Hungary in one year could provoke Ottoman retaliation in the next. Conversely, obedience to the Sultan could invite internal revolt from boyars who resented external interference. The borders were never fixed in terms of allegiance, and every shift in the political landscape required careful calculation. For Vlad, the lessons of his father's alliances, his own years as a hostage, and the stories of past rulers who had lost their lives to miscalculations were deeply ingrained by the time he reached adolescence. The principles of power were clear: survival depended on foresight, decisiveness, and sometimes unyielding severity. The boyars of Wallachia themselves represented a persistent and often unpredictable element in this delicate equilibrium. These noble families controlled significant estates across the principality, and their loyalties were not guaranteed by bloodline alone. Some aligned with Hungary, others with the Ottomans, and yet others shifted according to opportunity, ambition, or resentment. They were powerful players who could destabilize a voivode's rule almost as quickly as a foreign invasion, and managing them required not only diplomacy, but the capacity for swift and sometimes ruthless enforcement of authority. Vlad's upbringing had instilled an early awareness of the dangers posed by those closest to the throne, an understanding that would later manifest in his strict treatment of dissent within his principality. The geographic features of Wallachia reinforced the strategic importance of the principality. Rivers such as the Danube provided both a natural boundary and a route for trade, communication, and military movement. The southern plains allowed for the approach of Ottoman armies, while the northern valleys and mountain passes offered opportunities for defense or ambush. Each season brought different tactical considerations. Frozen rivers in winter could impede invasions but also hinder trade. The heavy rains of spring could make roads impassable, isolating communities and disrupting supply lines. The land itself demanded attention, planning, and adaptation from those who ruled it, further complicating the already intricate web of allegiances and political negotiation. It was within this environment that Vlad began to understand the nature of realpolitik, long before he would ascend to the throne. Alliances were never absolute, loyalty was transactional, and the consequences of misjudgment were immediate and often fatal. This understanding was reinforced through examples that had unfolded both during his father's reign and during the turbulent interregnums that marked Wallachia's history. Previous rulers had been deposed by boyars, assassinated in foreign courts, or executed by armies seeking to enforce Ottoman or Hungarian authority. The lessons were clear. A Wallachian prince's survival depended not only on his skill in battle, but on his mastery of strategy, perception, and the careful calibration of fear and respect. For the ordinary inhabitants of Wallachia, this political fluidity meant that life was lived under constant uncertainty. Villagers, peasants, and merchants adjusted their allegiances pragmatically, offering tribute, labor, and support to whichever authority held sway at the moment. Even the clergy, who often mediated disputes or wielded soft power through moral authority, operated within the constraints imposed by external and internal pressures. The cultural fabric of Wallachia, its songs, rituals, and folklore, often reflected these tensions, recounting stories of heroic resistance, betrayal, and survival in a land where certainty was a fleeting illusion. As the young Vlad observed these patterns, he absorbed lessons in both the mechanics of governance and the psychology of loyalty. He would have seen boyars dispute over positions of influence, measured their alliances carefully, and calculated the consequences of every perceived slight. He would have observed the subtle negotiations between local rulers and emissaries from Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, each interaction framed by the implicit threat of force. Through these observations, Vlad's understanding of power became multidimensional. It was not merely the capacity to command armies, but the ability to assess intentions, anticipate betrayal, and act decisively before threats could take root. The instability of Wallachia also created opportunities for ruthlessness and caution. A prince who could navigate these treacherous waters skillfully could secure the loyalty of allies, suppress internal dissent, and establish a reputation that dissuaded both external and internal adversaries from challenging his authority. Vlad's later reputation for severity, discipline, and the meticulous application of punishments can be traced directly to the lessons absorbed in these early years. He learned that fear, when wielded precisely, could serve as a tool of governance, balancing loyalty and obedience in a land where uncertainty was constant. Trade and diplomacy intertwined with these political realities. Wallachia's position along key routes between the Balkans and Central Europe meant that the principality was never isolated, even in times of relative peace. Merchants, envoys, and travelers brought news of foreign rulers, changing alliances, and military campaigns. This constant influx of information required a ruling prince to remain vigilant, to interpret intelligence carefully, and to respond with both speed and prudence. Vlad's exposure to these dynamics, reinforced by his formative experiences in Constantinople and within the pressures of his family, laid the groundwork for the strategic acumen he would later demonstrate in both military and political arenas. In sum, Wallachia during Vlad's formative years was not merely a physical landscape of mountains, rivers and villages. It was a dynamic arena where survival depended on perception, where loyalty was conditional, and where the slightest miscalculation could be fatal. The principality's position between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire demanded that its rulers navigate a labyrinth of external pressures and internal rivalries. Each decision had to be measured, each alliance carefully considered, each threat anticipated, and the young Vlad, returning from years in Ottoman captivity, stepped into this world with an acute awareness of its fragility, its dangers, and its expectations. It was in this environment, a land where power could shift with the passing of a messenger or the arrival of an army, that Vlad III's understanding of leadership, loyalty, and the role of fear was honed. The lessons of survival he had learned from his father, his captivity in Constantinople, and the volatile political landscape of Wallachia itself became intertwined, shaping a mind capable of both calculation and unflinching severity. As these early experiences consolidated into the framework of his character, the stage was set for the next phase of his life, where military and political challenges would test, and ultimately solidify, the extraordinary methods by which he would rule. The river valleys, forests and towns of Wallachia, though familiar to Vlad from childhood, now seemed like both home and arena, a space where every interaction, alliance and decision required careful negotiation. And it was within this complex and unforgiving context, caught between empires, bounded by treacherous loyalties, and defined by the constant presence of external threats, that Vlad III's journey toward authority and notoriety continued, moving inexorably toward the difficult and decisive years that would follow. The slow, deliberate rhythms of Wallachian life, already burdened by the ever-shifting demands of neighboring powers, provided little respite even for the most cautious of rulers. When Vlad III first returned from his years as a political hostage in the Ottoman Empire, he came not into a stable court or a principality governed with measured order, but into a realm where every pillar of authority was fragile, every relationship fraught with potential betrayal. The home he had left as a boy, a land of rivers, valleys and dense forests, remained physically unchanged, yet politically it had shifted in ways subtle and severe. The throne he had been born to inherit existed in name alone, a symbol more than a secure seat of power, vulnerable to the ambitions of boyars, foreign rulers, and internal rival claimants whose allegiance was conditional and transient. Upon his return, the young Vlad was confronted with a Wallachia deeply scarred by the pressures of dynastic fragility. His father, Vlad II Dracula, had been assassinated in the intricate and violent dance of Wallachian politics, leaving a vacuum that was immediately contested. The boyars, who held extensive power over the land and its people, moved quickly to secure their interests, often in opposition to one another, forming fragile alliances that could fracture at the smallest provocation. The Ottomans, ever watchful, had already asserted their influence in the region, expecting tribute and obedience, while Hungary continued to maintain a strategic interest, often through the support of rival claimants to the Wallachian throne. In such a landscape, Vlad III's first return was not a triumphant homecoming, but a cautious step into a web of instability that demanded both vigilance and cunning. The fractured nature of the Wallachian throne became evident immediately. Various noble families, emboldened by the absence of a strong central authority during Vlad's captivity, asserted their influence in local governance. Villages and towns that had once recognized the primacy of the ruling voivode operated with increasing autonomy, sometimes resisting direct orders or aligning with external powers when advantageous. It was a principality where authority was neither absolute nor secure, where the appearance of control was often maintained only through constant negotiation, intimidation, or the tacit acknowledgement of threats that lay beyond the immediate borders. For a young prince accustomed to the strict discipline of the Ottoman court, this environment was both confusing and instructive. It demonstrated the practical realities of rule. Loyalty could not be assumed, authority had to be asserted, and stability was a temporary, fragile achievement rather than a permanent condition. Vlad's first experiences of governance were thus shaped not by ceremonial or abstract ideals of kingship, but by the urgent necessity of asserting control over a volatile and fractured realm. The boyars, some motivated by personal ambition, others by the shifting allegiances demanded by external powers, presented an ongoing challenge. Their disputes were rarely straightforward, often rooted in centuries of familial grievance or territorial competition, and their willingness to align with foreign powers further complicated any effort to consolidate authority. Vlad, observing these dynamics, began to form an understanding that would later define his rule, that fear, precision, and decisiveness could sometimes achieve in hours what negotiation and goodwill could not accomplish in months. This early exposure to internal political turbulence reinforced the lessons he had absorbed during his years in Ottoman captivity. While in Constantinople, he had learned discipline, observation, and strategic thinking under constant supervision. Now he witnessed how those lessons could be applied, or misapplied, within the fluid and unpredictable environment of Wallachian politics. The contrast between the structured hierarchical authority of the empire and the fragmented, often chaotic governance of his homeland underscored the challenges of maintaining sovereignty in a region perpetually contested by both internal factions and foreign powers. Vlad's brief tenure upon his first return also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in Wallachian succession. The principality did not operate under strict primogeniture. Instead, the throne was often claimed through a combination of hereditary right, boyar support, and the endorsement of external powers such as the Ottoman Sultan or the Hungarian crown. In this environment, even a legitimate heir could be deposed if he failed to secure sufficient loyalty or display the resolve necessary to suppress dissent. Vlad's early exposure to this reality likely reinforced both a sense of caution and a willingness to employ uncompromising measures, recognizing that hesitation or leniency could be interpreted as weakness, leaving the throne exposed to usurpation or external intervention. Amidst these tensions, Vlad's understanding of power became increasingly intertwined with the practicalities of enforcement. While external threats such as the Ottomans and Hungarians demanded diplomatic engagement and strategic calculation, internal threats required a different approach. The boyars, who controlled resources, militias, and territorial loyalty, could undermine or even depose a ruler who did not maintain their support, or at least their fear. Vlad's later reputation for strict and often brutal enforcement of laws, his meticulous attention to perceived slights, and his insistence on uncompromising authority can be traced back, in part, to these early lessons on the fractured nature of Wallachian rule. The instability he encountered upon his first return was not simply political, it was formative, shaping both the tactics he would employ and the temperament that would become synonymous with his name. The social and economic consequences of political instability also reinforced the precariousness of Vlad's position. Peasant communities, subjected to the authority of both boyars and voivodes, often bore the brunt of taxation and conscription, while towns and trade routes were vulnerable to external raids and internal disputes. A ruler attempting to assert control had to navigate these pressures carefully, balancing the demands of administration with the ever-present need to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of both the governed and the governing elite. Vlad's early awareness of these dynamics would later inform his approach to both punishment and governance, emphasizing order and discipline as prerequisites for survival in a land where disorder could spread rapidly and decisively. This period also exposed Vlad to the broader European and regional context that continuously shaped Wallachia's fate. The Ottoman Empire, consolidating power across the Balkans, exerted a persistent influence through military presence, tribute demands, and the strategic placement of loyalists within Wallachian politics. Hungary, with its intermittent interventions and support for rival claimants, served both as a potential protector and a source of tension. Navigating these external pressures required not only awareness but decisive action, for missteps could provoke military incursion, internal revolt, or the removal of a ruler entirely. Vlad's early encounters with these forces were instructive, demonstrating that political authority in Wallachia was as much about perception, negotiation, and intimidation as it was about hereditary right. Even within the domestic sphere, alliances were conditional, loyalties often fragile. The boyar's willingness to shift support, combined with the ongoing threat of foreign intervention, created a political atmosphere in which authority was tenuous and survival demanded constant vigilance. Vlad's first return, brief though it was, provided him with a vivid lesson in the nature of rule within a fractured society. Authority had to be earned, demonstrated and maintained through decisive, sometimes harsh, measures. Any lapse in attention or firmness could be exploited, leading to instability that would ripple across both court and countryside. Through this turbulent period, the foundations of Vlad III's later reputation, discipline, precision and severity were laid. He came to understand that Wallachia's unique position between two empires, its deeply divided nobility, and the unpredictable nature of succession demanded a ruler capable of imposing order where chaos threatened. The lessons of his first return were not academic, they were practical, immediate, and often unforgiving. They emphasized that the survival of a ruler, and by extension the principality itself, depended on the ability to act decisively, to anticipate threats, and to maintain authority even in the face of constant challenge. Thus the first return of Vlad III to a fractured Wallachian throne provided more than a glimpse into the difficulties of governance. It offered a formative experience in the complexities of power, loyalty, and survival. The instability he encountered would remain a defining feature of the principality throughout his reign, shaping not only his strategies as a ruler, but the principles that governed his interactions with boyars, foreign powers, and the broader population. As these lessons took root, the stage was set for the next phase of his development, a period in which he would begin to forge the methods of authority and control that would define his rule and the legacy of his name for centuries to come. The air over Wallachia carried a palpable tension when Vlad III returned once more to claim his principality, this time with the intention of asserting a dominion that would no longer be tentative or easily contested. The land itself, shaped by centuries of forested mountains, river valleys, and small fortified towns, seemed to wait quietly for the emergence of a ruler who could navigate its delicate balance of power and loyalty. Though the terrain remained familiar, the Carpathian ridges lining the northern horizon, the slow meandering rivers threading through the plains, and the dense shadowed forests that had sheltered villagers for generations, the political landscape had changed, and not always for the better. The fragility of Wallachia's internal structure, the divisions among the boyars, and the lingering influence of the Ottoman Empire and Hungarian interests created an environment in which the reclamation of power would require not only strategy, but a decisive and often uncompromising approach. Vlad's return was preceded by careful planning and a calculated understanding of the dynamics that had allowed others to seize the throne during his father's reign and following his first return. Wallachia had been marked by administrative decay, a state of affairs not uncommon in a principality perpetually caught between foreign pressures and internal rivalries. Roads and trade routes had fallen into disrepair, communication between towns was inconsistent, and tax collection had been uneven at best, often exacerbating discontent among peasants and town dwellers alike. The boyars, many of whom had benefited from the previous instability, resisted efforts to restore centralized authority. In order to reclaim Wallachia effectively, Vlad understood that he would first need to re-establish the structures of governance, enforce the rule of law, and consolidate loyalty, while carefully projecting both authority and the capacity for swift justice. The process of his second ascension was gradual, measured, and deliberate. Unlike the impulsive or ceremonial assumption of a crown that might signal dominance without substance, Vlad's approach was methodical, rooted in an understanding of the fragility that had characterized Wallachia for decades. He began by assessing the loyalties of the boyars, distinguishing between those who could be relied upon, those whose allegiance could be purchased or coerced, and those whose ambitions made them irreconcilable opponents. These early judgments, while subtle and often hidden from public view, laid the groundwork for the control he would impose across the principality, establishing a foundation that combined political calculation, psychological insight, and the demonstration of unyielding authority. Administrative decay presented a more structural challenge. Years of inconsistent rule had left governmental mechanisms weakened. Tax collection, essential for both economic stability and military preparedness, had been irregular. Disputes over land ownership were unresolved and local justice had been fragmented, often administered according to personal influence rather than codified law. Vlad's methodical approach required addressing each of these weaknesses in turn. Records were scrutinized, disputes adjudicated with attention to precedent and consequence, and the machinery of the principality reinforced with measures designed to signal that central authority was both returning and unyielding. The perception of strength became as important as the reality, for in a land accustomed to shifting allegiances, appearances of decisive control often determined whether loyalty would be freely offered or cautiously withheld. The air over Wallachia carried a palpable tension when Vlad III returned once more to claim his principality, this time with the intention of asserting a dominion that would no longer be tentative or easily contested. The land itself, shaped by centuries of forested mountains, river valleys, and small fortified towns, seemed to wait quietly for the emergence of a ruler who could navigate its delicate balance of power and loyalty. Though the terrain remained familiar, the Carpathian ridges lining the northern horizon, the slow meandering rivers threading through the plains, and the dense, shadowed forests that had sheltered villagers for generations, the political landscape had changed, and not always for the better. The fragility of Wallachia's internal structure, the divisions among the boyars, and the lingering influence of the Ottoman Empire and Hungarian interests created an environment in which the reclamation of power would require not only strategy, but a decisive and often uncompromising approach. Vlad's return was preceded by careful planning and a calculated understanding of the dynamics that had allowed others to seize the throne during his father's reign and following his first return. Wallachia had been marked by administrative decay, a state of affairs not uncommon in a principality perpetually caught between foreign pressures and internal rivalries. Roads and trade routes had fallen into disrepair, communication between towns was inconsistent, and tax collection had been uneven at best, often exacerbating discontent among peasants and town dwellers alike. The boyars, many of whom had benefited from the previous instability, resisted efforts to restore centralized authority. In order to reclaim Wallachia effectively, Vlad understood that he would first need to re-establish the structures of governance, enforce the rule of law, and consolidate loyalty, while carefully projecting both authority and the capacity for swift justice. The process of his second ascension was gradual, measured, and deliberate. Unlike the impulsive or ceremonial assumption of a crown that might signal dominance without substance, Vlad's approach was methodical, rooted in an understanding of the fragility that had characterized Wallachia for decades. He began by assessing the loyalties of the boyars, distinguishing between those who could be relied upon, those whose allegiance could be purchased or coerced, and those whose ambitions made them irreconcilable opponents. These early judgments, while subtle and often hidden from public view, laid the groundwork for the control he would impose across the principality, establishing a foundation that combined political calculation, psychological insight, and the demonstration of unyielding authority. Administrative decay presented a more structural challenge. Years of inconsistent rule had left governmental mechanisms weakened. Tax collection, essential for both economic stability and military preparedness, had been irregular, disputes over land ownership were unresolved, and local justice had been fragmented, often administered according to personal influence rather than codified law. Vlad's methodical approach required addressing each of these weaknesses in turn. Records were scrutinized, disputes adjudicated with attention to precedent and consequence, and the machinery of the principality reinforced with measures designed to signal that central authority was both returning and unyielding. The perception of strength became as important as the reality, for in a land accustomed to shifting allegiances, appearances of decisive control often determined whether loyalty would be freely offered or cautiously withheld. Beyond administrative repair, Vlad's reclamation of power involved establishing a sense of security, both for his supporters and for the broader population. The roads and river routes that had once facilitated trade and communication were also potential avenues for insurgency or rebellion, and the forests, while providing shelter for villagers, could harbor those opposed to his rule. Military organization, therefore, became a critical aspect of his ascension. Local militias were reorganized under the supervision of loyal boyars, garrisons reinforced, and strategic fortresses maintained vigilance over critical passes and settlements. By combining administrative reforms with visible demonstrations of military preparedness, Vlad communicated the dual message that Wallachia was returning to order and that dissent would not be tolerated lightly. The consolidation of authority was not only a matter of practical administration and military readiness, it required psychological insight into the behavior of those who had thrived under the preceding disorder. The boyars, accustomed to exploiting weakness, now faced a ruler who combined both the memory of Ottoman rigor and the strategic acumen that came from years of observation and careful calculation. Loyalty was no longer assumed, and negotiation was inseparable from the projection of power. Vlad's approach involved carefully measured displays of both reward and punishment, ensuring that those who supported him understood the benefits of allegiance, while those who resisted observed the consequences of opposition. These measures, subtle and often invisible to the common populace, reinforced his authority and stabilized the fractured framework of the principality. Economic stability was another crucial element of Vlad's second ascension. The collection of taxes, the enforcement of property rights, and the management of resources were essential not only for sustaining his administration, but for maintaining the loyalty of those whose livelihoods depended upon order. Vlad understood that governance required balancing the needs of the state with the demands of the people, and that economic security was inextricable from the perception of competent and decisive rule. He implemented systems to ensure more consistent collection, regulated disputes over land and production, and monitored trade routes to prevent exploitation by opportunistic nobles or external forces. These efforts, though painstaking and slow, contributed to a sense that Wallachia under his rule was returning to a measure of order and predictability previously absent. In addition to practical governance, Vlad's return was characterized by the gradual cultivation of a reputation that would reinforce his authority. The perception of decisiveness, the willingness to act swiftly against threats, and the meticulous enforcement of laws were as important as the administrative and military measures he implemented. These early steps in consolidating his rule established a psychological environment in which his word carried weight, and his presence, even when not physically observed, influenced the behavior of boyars, townspeople, and neighboring powers alike. Vlad's methodical approach ensured that loyalty was earned not only through negotiation, but through the careful demonstration of capacity, severity, and strategic foresight. Throughout this period, Vlad's experiences in both Wallachia and Constantinople continued to inform his decisions. He combined the lessons of discipline and observation learned as a hostage with the intimate understanding of local dynamics acquired during his father's reign and his first return. His administration emphasized vigilance, precision, and the interweaving of fear and respect as tools of governance. By addressing the administrative decay, reinforcing military and civic structures, and carefully managing alliances and perceptions, Vlad III transformed a principality marked by instability into one in which authority was recognized, if not always willingly embraced. As Vlad established control, the fractured throne of Wallachia began to solidify under his deliberate hand. The boyars, the military, and the broader population gradually adapted to the certainty imposed by his rule, and the principality began to function as a coherent entity once more. Yet this cohesion came not from compromise or indulgence, but from the patient, calculated application of authority, reinforced through the disciplined administration of justice, strategic enforcement of loyalty, and the careful projection of strength. In these formative years, Vlad III's methods, at once meticulous, rigorous, and uncompromising, took root, setting the stage for the period of rule that would define his legacy and cement his reputation across both the Balkans and European consciousness. Thus, Vlad's second ascension to power was not merely a reclamation of a throne, it was the beginning of a methodical transformation of Wallachia from a fractured, vulnerable principality into a state capable of enforcing order, maintaining loyalty, and asserting authority over both internal and external pressures. Every decision, every measure, and every carefully administered action contributed to the slow, deliberate re-establishment of control, preparing the land and its people for the extraordinary, and often terrifying, presence of the ruler who would become synonymous with both discipline and fear. Vlad III's consolidation of power in Wallachia, having secured the throne through careful strategy and deliberate displays of authority, was accompanied by a relentless focus on restoring order, efficiency, and loyalty within a principality that had long suffered from administrative neglect, corruption, and fragmented governance. The landscape he inherited was one of inconsistency, where taxes were frequently evaded, local officials enriched themselves at the expense of both the central treasury and the peasantry, and the fractured loyalties of the boyars threatened the stability of any ruler who lacked the will or the means to assert dominance. To address these entrenched issues, Vlad implemented a series of reforms that were meticulous, exacting, and in the eyes of many contemporaries severe. These measures, designed to strengthen governance and reinforce the perception of authority, would soon become inseparable from the enduring reputation of severity for which his name is known. The first aspect of his reform was the rigorous enforcement of taxation, a system vital not only for the economic health of Wallachia, but also for the stability of his rule. In previous administrations, taxes had been irregularly collected, often absorbed by intermediaries, and at times entirely neglected, resulting in a depletion of the state's resources and leaving the principality vulnerable to external threats. Vlad understood that a ruler's strength depended in part on the steady flow of resources, which enabled military readiness, administrative functioning, and the maintenance of infrastructure. To this end, he instituted measures that required both nobles and commoners to comply with established tax obligations. Inspectors were dispatched to oversee collection, disputes were adjudicated swiftly, and the consequences of non-compliance were made clear through both punitive and highly visible examples. Anti-corruption campaigns became another cornerstone of his governance. This disdays his brufov, the follower peace. The streetudes de legintunci, the boyars, some of whom had long enjoyed relative autonomy, were compelled to adhere to strict accountability standards. Wealth obtained through deception, embezzlement, or exploitation of peasants was subjected to confiscation, fines, and occasionally harsher forms of punishment. Vlad's approach was not simply administrative. It was symbolic, designed to demonstrate that no one, regardless of rank or familial influence, was above the reach of central authority. These measures, exacting as they were, cultivated a climate in which loyalty could be maintained only through respect for law, and the understanding that violations of trust or duty would be met with swift consequence. The emerging pattern of severity also reflected a broader philosophy of governance, one in which fear was used as a tool to enforce compliance and to deter misconduct before it could manifest. Vlad's experiences in Ottoman captivity and his observation of disciplined military hierarchies had instilled a profound understanding of authority as both projection and enforcement. The punitive measures he employed, often public and deliberate, were intended not merely to punish transgressors, but to communicate the certainty of justice to all observers. This approach to governance emphasized preemptive deterrence. When wrongdoers witnessed the consequences faced by others, they were more likely to adhere to law and obligation, ensuring stability across the principality. One of the most significant manifestations of Vlad's early severity was the introduction of harsh and often terrifying punishments for transgressions, ranging from minor infractions to acts of rebellion or corruption. Methods were designed not only to enforce justice, but also to create a visual and psychological impression of unassailable authority. Accounts from contemporary observers describe punishments as exacting, deliberate, and highly visible, reinforcing the understanding that Vlad's governance would brook neither negligence nor defiance. By intertwining law enforcement with the projection of fear, he established a pattern in which order was maintained through the simultaneous presence of discipline and deterrence. Vlad's administrative reforms were also deeply interconnected with his strategies for economic and military stabilization. By ensuring the reliable collection of taxes and the elimination of corruption among officials, resources were freed for the maintenance of roads, fortresses, and garrisons. Trade routes, often disrupted by banditry or boyar interference, could function more effectively, bolstering both commerce and communication. Military readiness was reinforced, as funds became available for the training and provisioning of troops, the repair of strategic fortifications, and the construction of defenses along critical river crossings and mountain passes. These measures underscored the pragmatic aspect of Vlad's severity. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but a deliberate and calculated method to strengthen the principality against both internal disorder and external threat. The social and psychological dimensions of these reforms were equally significant. Peasants, often subjected to exploitation by intermediaries or boyars in the past, witnessed a restoration of order that, while strict, provided a more predictable framework for daily life. Their compliance, enforced by the certainty of punishment for both themselves and others, ensured stability and allowed the principality to function more cohesively. Similarly, the boyars whose ambitions had once thrived in an environment of irregular oversight learned that their actions would be observed, evaluated, and when necessary curtailed with precision. In this way, Vlad's measures addressed both the structural and human dimensions of governance, integrating fear, discipline, and accountability into a unified system of control. The emphasis on severity and visible enforcement was reinforced by cultural and symbolic practices that drew upon both Wallachian tradition and lessons from Vlad's formative years in the Ottoman Empire. Justice was public, deliberate, and memorable, designed to instill recognition of the consequences of transgression in the minds of witnesses. This approach created an environment in which authority was self-reinforcing. The spectacle of punishment served as a continuous reminder of the ruler's capacity to enforce law, while also shaping perceptions of loyalty, fear, and the consequences of defiance. Vlad's application of such measures reflected a nuanced understanding of human psychology, recognizing that the effectiveness of governance depended not merely on the legal framework itself, but on the perception and internalization of authority among both elite and common populations. By the time these reforms were fully underway, Vlad's governance had begun to transform the principality from a fragmented, vulnerable state into one where order, compliance, and accountability were established, albeit through rigorous and often terrifying means. The visibility of enforcement, combined with the certainty of punishment for those who violated the rules, served to stabilize Wallachia internally, while the careful management of alliances, tribute obligations, and military preparedness positioned the principality more securely in the broader geopolitical context between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. It is within this period of early reform that the foundations of Vlad III's lasting reputation for severity were established. The intertwining of administrative rigor, anti-corruption campaigns, strict taxation enforcement, and deliberate displays of justice created an image of a ruler both capable and uncompromising. Observers, whether boyars, townspeople, or foreign emissaries, came to recognize that Vlad's authority was rooted in meticulous preparation, unwavering attention to law, and the consistent application of consequences. The principles underlying these reforms, discipline, foresight, and the integration of fear as a governing tool, would shape not only his reign, but the enduring legacy that would make his name synonymous with a form of order both respected and feared. Through these early efforts to establish a functioning, disciplined, and authoritative administration, Vlad III transformed Wallachia into a principality in which governance was visible, accountability was immediate, and the consequences of defiance were unmistakable. The methods were exacting, the reforms deliberate, and the results undeniable. A ruler who combined strategic intelligence, rigorous administration, and the meticulous application of justice had begun to impose coherence on a realm that had long been defined by instability. These measures, rooted in both necessity and calculation, marked the emergence of a leader whose influence would extend far beyond the immediate confines of Wallachia, shaping perceptions of authority, severity, and the intertwining of law and fear for generations to come. Among the measures that defined Vlad III's governance, none has captured historical imagination, and indeed the darker curiosity of posterity, more than the practice of impalement. Within the shadowed forests, rolling hills, and fortified towns of Wallachia, the method of punishing transgressors with sharpened stakes was employed not merely as retribution, but as a deliberate instrument of psychological and political authority. To understand its use and prevalence, it is necessary to explore not only the mechanics of the practice itself, but also its cultural, symbolic, and strategic significance within both Wallachian and broader Eastern European contexts, including the Ottoman Empire, from which some precedents of such punishments could be observed. The methodical application of this extreme form of justice was as much a calculated act of governance as it was a reflection of Vlad's formative understanding of fear, order, and deterrence. Impalement, in its simplest form, involved the deliberate penetration of the human body with a long wooden stake, driven through the torso or other parts of the body, often anchored into the ground so that the victim's weight ensured a slow, agonizing death. The procedure could vary in technique, duration, and execution depending on the severity of the crime, the social status of the condemned, and the intended message to witnesses. In Eastern Europe during the 15th century, as well as within certain Ottoman practices, impalement was not entirely unique. It existed as part of a broader repertoire of punitive measures designed to enforce authority through terror. What distinguished Vlad's employment of the method, however, was the scale, consistency, and intentional symbolism with which it was used as a political tool. The purpose of impalement extended far beyond mere retribution for criminal behavior or insubordination. It was deeply psychological, designed to instill fear both in those present at the site of punishment and in those who would hear of the events from nearby villages, passing merchants or travelers. The public display of transgressors impaled upon stakes created an unmistakable lesson. Opposition, treachery, or corruption would be met with consequences that were both immediate and unforgettable. In this sense, the act became a method of governance as much as a form of punishment, reinforcing Vlad's authority across the principality and reminding both nobility and commoners of the unyielding reach of central power. The methods by which impalement was executed were precise, deliberate, and in their own ritualistic way, systematic. Stakes were typically sharpened to a point, smoothed to minimize immediate tearing or breakage, and prepared in advance for both speed of execution and visual impact. Victims were often paraded to the site of punishment, sometimes restrained on carts or dragged through towns, creating a spectacle that ensured maximum exposure to onlookers. The act itself was slow, and the duration of suffering could vary, depending on whether the stake was driven vertically, horizontally, or at an angle designed to prolong life for observation purposes. Death was almost invariably agonizing, allowing observers to witness the consequences of disobedience in stark, unmistakable terms. The symbolism inherent in impalement was layered and deliberate. The vertical stake, emerging from the ground and piercing the human form, represented the absolute enforcement of law and authority, a literal and visual assertion that the will of the ruler could pierce even the most resistant or defiant subjects. Beyond the immediate psychological effect, it served as a form of communication, a message encoded in suffering and spectacle, understandable without words. To any who observed or heard of the punishments, the practice demonstrated that Vlad's authority was backed by both resolve and the willingness to implement extreme measures. In the context of Wallachia's turbulent political environment, where boyars and local leaders might otherwise challenge his rule, this symbolism was not mere theatrics. It was a form of strategic deterrence. Vlad's employment of impalement was also influenced by precedent and observation. The Ottoman Empire during his years in captivity made use of extreme punitive methods, and Eastern European rulers occasionally employed harsh punishments to maintain order. Vlad's exposure to these practices, combined with the lessons of his own captivity and his observations of human psychology under threat, informed a governance style in which fear became a deliberate instrument. Impalement was not indiscriminate, but calculated, aimed at individuals whose behavior or example threatened the stability of his principality or the demonstration of his authority. By targeting both high-ranking officials and rebellious commoners, Vlad created a network of deterrence visible across social hierarchies. The ritualization of impalement was as much about visibility as it was about enforcement. Victims were often displayed along major roads, at town entrances, or near the banks of rivers, locations that ensured that travelers, merchants, and villagers would witness or learn of the consequences of disobedience. This method of displaying punishment extended the psychological reach of Vlad's authority beyond the immediate vicinity of the act, projecting power across the landscape of Wallachia. Observers internalized both the severity of the consequences and the inescapable presence of the prince's control, reinforcing loyalty or compliance through fear, even in the absence of direct governance. Vlad's use of impalement also carried a moral and political dimension that was recognized in contemporary accounts. By applying punishment visibly and consistently, he framed himself as a ruler committed to justice and order, particularly in a society where corruption and betrayal had previously eroded the stability of rule. In punishing those who defied law, neglected obligations, or challenged authority, Vlad demonstrated that the mechanisms of governance were precise, impartial, and enforceable. While modern readers may recoil at the methods, within the context of 15th century Wallachia, these practices reflected a conscious effort to restore order and deter rebellion in a principality beset by political fragility and external threats. The psychological effect on both the observer and the governed cannot be overstated. Stories of impalement carried by merchants, travelers, and returning soldiers spread through the towns and villages of Wallachia, creating a pervasive sense of caution, even awe. Villagers, knowing the consequences of transgression or defiance, were more likely to comply with taxation, report misconduct, and respect local authority. Boyars whose ambitions and power had previously allowed them to challenge voivodes with relative impunity were forced to acknowledge the limits of their influence and the certainty of consequences should they test the boundaries of authority. In this manner, the method functioned as both practical enforcement and psychological conditioning, ensuring that fear itself became a mechanism for maintaining order. It is important to recognize that impalement was not Vlad's sole method of governance, but was integrated into a broader system of law, administration, and military control. Its purpose was strategic and symbolic, reinforcing the other measures that constituted his rule, including the enforcement of taxation, suppression of corruption, and oversight of military and civic operations. By coupling visible, severe punishment with meticulous administration and calculated authority, Vlad created a system in which fear, discipline, and the projection of power coexisted with practical governance, ensuring the continued stability of a principality otherwise vulnerable to internal division and external pressure. Thus, the ritual of impalement was more than a brutal spectacle, it was an instrument of authority, communication, and strategic control. Vlad III employed it deliberately, shaping both his reputation and the behavior of his subjects. The practice, horrific in its execution yet precise in purpose, reflected his understanding of human psychology, the fragility of Wallachian governance, and the necessity of enforcing obedience through certainty of consequence. In the shadow of forests, along the banks of rivers, and across the hills and towns of Wallachia, the presence of impaled transgressors served as a constant reminder that authority was absolute, observant, and unyielding, marking a critical chapter in the consolidation of Vlad's rule and the cultivation of his enduring fearsome legacy. The landscapes of Wallachia, often shrouded in mist and shadowed by dense forests, became the backdrop for some of the most chilling and psychologically potent demonstrations of Vlad III's authority. Among these, the infamous Forest of the Impaled stands as both a historical event and a symbol of the terrifying effectiveness of fear as a tool of governance and war. While the act of impalement itself had already been employed with deliberate precision as a method of justice and deterrence, the scale and intentionality of these mass executions transformed certain areas of Wallachia into terrifying visual statements, reshaping both the physical and psychological terrain of the principality. These scenes, which contemporary accounts recount with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration, reveal the methods by which Vlad extended the reach of his authority, projecting power far beyond the immediate confines of his court or military encampment. The Forest of the Impaled was not a spontaneous or chaotic occurrence, but the culmination of careful strategic planning designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Vlad's campaigns against rebels, invading forces, and treacherous boyars often resulted in large numbers of captured enemies, whose fate was determined with calculated deliberation. Stakes were prepared in advance, often along major approaches to towns, forts, or regions of strategic significance, where travelers, soldiers, and local populations would be sure to witness the consequences of defiance. Those condemned were impaled systematically, with attention to both the visual and psychological effect. The result was a forested area transformed into a deliberate spectacle of horror, the ground punctuated by countless vertical stakes, each bearing the bodies of those who had defied authority, leaving an unmistakable testament to the reach of Vlad's power. Contemporary observers, including diplomats, merchants, and chroniclers, recorded the visceral impact of encountering such sights. Travelers approaching the Forest of the Impaled were confronted not only with the immediate sight of the bodies, swaying in the wind or silhouetted against the landscape, but with the knowledge that the ruler responsible for this display possessed both the will and capacity to enforce law without compromise. The psychological effect was multifaceted. Enemies were deterred from future attacks or rebellion, allies were reassured of the ruler's power to protect and maintain order, and the broader population internalized the certainty that disobedience or betrayal would be met with consequences beyond the imagination of ordinary law. The forest itself became a tool of governance, a visual and spatial method of asserting authority across distances where direct enforcement was impossible. The scale of these executions was remarkable. Reports suggest that thousands of individuals could be impaled in a single campaign, often stretching along roads, riverbanks, and strategic passes. These figures, while varying according to source, highlight the deliberate and systematic nature of Vlad's methods. Such acts were not carried out in private or hidden from public view, rather they were designed to maximize the reach of authority, ensuring that any observer, whether soldier, merchant, or local villager, would internalize the consequences of resistance. The massed stakes created both a literal and symbolic forest, a transformed landscape that bore witness to the intertwining of power, fear, and governance. The psychological implications for enemies were profound. Hungarian forces, Ottoman raiders, and rival claimants who encountered the Forest of the Impaled were confronted with a clear message. Resistance to Vlad's authority was not merely dangerous, it was fatal in the most visible and terrifying manner possible. Stories of these forests traveled far beyond Wallachia, carried by merchants, travelers, and diplomats, amplifying the reputational impact of Vlad's actions. The visual horror of impaled bodies served as a force multiplier, extending the reach of authority without requiring the continuous deployment of troops or resources. In this sense, the Forest of the Impaled functioned both as punishment and a strategic deterrent, reshaping the calculus of opponents and influencing the course of military campaigns and political negotiations alike. The effect on allies and internal populations was similarly complex. The boyars and local officials, accustomed to leveraging disorder for personal gain, recognized the consequences of defiance and the necessity of compliance. The certainty with which punishments were applied demonstrated that loyalty was not a matter of convenience, but a requirement for survival and political continuity. Peasants and villagers, too, internalized the lesson, gaining both a sense of protection, knowing that law and order were enforced, and a recognition of the uncompromising nature of authority. The Forest of the Impaled communicated the principles of governance in a language beyond words, embedding fear, respect, and obedience into the consciousness of those who lived within and near Wallachia. the strategic selection of location amplified the effect. Stakes were often placed in areas that forced travelers to pass directly through the spectacle, or along borders and trade routes where external observers could witness the consequences of disobedience without entering Wallachia itself. These placements ensured that the psychological impact of the punishments was multiplied, extending the reach of authority into regions far from the prince's immediate control. The forests themselves, already places associated with mystery, danger, and isolation, became staged settings for a deliberate demonstration of power, transforming natural landscapes into instruments of governance. Vlad's careful integration of these public punishments into broader military and political strategy reveals the depth of his understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of authority. The forests served not merely as punitive sites but as communication channels, projecting a reputation for decisive and unyielding governance. By creating a landscape in which fear was physically and symbolically embedded, Vlad ensured that his enemies calculated the costs of action with extreme caution, allies recognized the benefits of loyalty, and the general population internalized the mechanisms of order. The effect was enduring, shaping perceptions of his rule for generations and contributing to both historical accounts and the legends that would eventually surround his name. The scale, precision, and psychological sophistication of these executions distinguished them from simple cruelty or sadism. While the acts themselves were undeniably brutal, they were embedded within a larger system of governance that relied upon law, administration, and the projection of authority. Impalement, and the creation of forests populated with the bodies of the condemned, became an instrument of statecraft, ensuring that the consequences of disorder were immediate, visible, and memorable. These forests were as much a reflection of strategy as of severity, demonstrating that Vlad's methods were deliberate, systematic, and designed to reinforce stability in a principality otherwise characterized by fragility and the constant threat of internal and external challenge. In the memory of contemporaries, the Forest of the Impaled created an enduring impression, one that would resonate in the reports of travelers, the correspondence of diplomats, and the chronicles of neighboring powers. It communicated lessons about the nature of authority, the consequences of defiance, and the intertwining of law, fear, and strategy in governance. The forests became more than a moment of punishment. They were a permanent imprint upon the collective imagination, ensuring that Vlad's reputation as a ruler, capable of both strategic foresight and extraordinary severity, would extend far beyond the immediate temporal and geographic confines of Wallachia. Thus, the Forests of the Impaled represent the culmination of Vlad's deliberate use of fear as a tool of political, military, and psychological control. By transforming natural landscapes into vivid symbols of authority, by executing transgressors with precision and deliberation, and by ensuring that the spectacle of punishment reached both internal and external audiences, Vlad III shaped a perception of his principality as a space where law was absolute, obedience essential, and defiance fatal. In doing so, he fortified both his immediate rule and the enduring legacy of his name, embedding lessons in fear and discipline into the very geography of Wallachia itself. While Vlad III's reign in Wallachia was marked by consolidation, strict governance, and the enforcement of order through both law and fear, the wider political landscape of southeastern Europe was shifting with inexorable force. To the south and southeast, the Ottoman Empire, under the ambitious and tactically brilliant leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, was advancing steadily into the Balkans, reshaping the balance of power across the region. Wallachia, situated precariously between Hungary and the expanding Ottoman territories, existed under constant pressure, its political decisions and military preparedness influenced as much by geography as by internal governance. The forests, rivers, and plains that Vlad III had worked to secure and administer were now potential battlegrounds, buffer zones, and strategic corridors, their significance magnified by the movements of a distant but ever-present empire. Mehmed II, having successfully captured Constantinople in 1453, had established the Ottomans as a dominant power in the region. The Sultan's campaigns were characterized by meticulous planning, overwhelming logistical support, and a relentless drive to extend imperial authority into territories that had long resisted subjugation. For Wallachia, the shadow of Ottoman expansion was not an abstract threat, but a tangible reality, visible in the mobilization of troops along the Danube, in the strategic placement of garrisons in neighboring provinces, and in the implicit expectation that Wallachian rulers maintain obedience and provide tribute. The expansionist policy of Mehmed II meant that any act of defiance or hesitation on the part of Wallachia could provoke direct military action, placing immense pressure on the voivode to anticipate, negotiate, and if necessary, resist with both strategic calculation and the full extent of his principality's defensive capabilities. Vlad III, intimately aware of the empire's methods and intentions, had reason to regard the Ottoman advance with a mixture of caution, strategic observation, and anticipation of conflict. His experiences as a hostage in the Ottoman court had provided him with insight into the bureaucratic precision, military discipline, and political ruthlessness that characterized the Sultan's administration. He understood that Ottoman campaigns were not isolated raids, but the culmination of careful reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and logistical planning. Wallachia's forests and mountains, while providing natural defenses, could also be penetrated or bypassed by a determined and organized force, requiring both preparation and a capacity for rapid strategic response. The strategic goals of Mehmed II in the region were multifaceted. Beyond territorial expansion, the Sultan sought to secure critical trade routes, impose tribute on neighboring principalities, and establish vassal states that could serve both as buffers against European powers and as sources of military and economic resources for the empire. Wallachia, situated at the northern edge of Ottoman influence, became a focal point in this strategy. Its allegiance was both desired and contested, as the principality's submission would not only provide a valuable corridor for movement and communication, but also demonstrate the Sultan's capacity to project authority beyond direct conquest. For Vlad III, this placed Wallachia in a position that required careful diplomacy, rigorous defense preparation, and the ability to demonstrate both loyalty and autonomy when circumstances demanded. The psychological dimension of the Ottoman threat cannot be underestimated. Reports of the Sultan's prior campaigns, the fall of Constantinople, and the disciplined efficiency of Ottoman armies reached the courts and villages of Wallachia, instilling both awe and apprehension. The anticipation of conflict, the knowledge of the empire's military prowess, and the uncertainty of the political landscape created an environment in which rulers were forced to think not only in terms of immediate administration, but also in terms of long-term survival. Vlad's awareness of these pressures influenced both his domestic policies and his military strategy, reinforcing the interconnection between internal order and the capacity to resist or negotiate with a powerful external adversary. As Ottoman forces advanced, Wallachia's geography became increasingly significant. The Danube River, the Carpathian Mountains, and the network of forests provided natural defensive positions, but also potential avenues of movement for a highly organized army. Control over fortifications, river crossings, and mountain passes became essential, as these points could serve as both bulwarks and choke points in the event of invasion. Vlad III's prior efforts to consolidate administrative control and reinforce loyalty among the boyars and local militias assumed additional importance, for the effectiveness of defensive measures relied upon both coordination and compliance across the principality. In this way, domestic governance and external threat were inseparable. One could not be managed successfully without careful consideration of the other. Diplomacy played a critical role alongside military preparation. Vlad III understood that negotiation, tribute, and calculated submission were tools as necessary as swords and fortifications in maintaining sovereignty under the shadow of the Ottoman advance. The principality's history of vassalage, tribute payments, and intermittent alignment with neighboring powers required a delicate balance, as any misstep could provoke punitive campaigns or create openings for rival claimants to exploit. The voivode's ability to navigate these pressures was informed by his experience, observation, and understanding of both Ottoman and European political culture, allowing him to anticipate moves, respond decisively, and maintain a degree of autonomy, despite the overwhelming external threat. The approach of Mehmed Tisami's was accompanied by a careful assessment of potential weaknesses within Wallachia, intelligence gathering, the cultivation of local informants, and the strategic positioning of troops ensured that Ottoman campaigns were not blind or haphazard. Vlad's awareness of this process, combined with his meticulous internal governance, allowed him to identify vulnerabilities, fortify critical points, and implement contingency measures designed to delay, deter, or repel incursions. The interplay between anticipation, preparation, and psychological projection of power created a dynamic environment in which both ruler and empire were engaged in a continuous negotiation of threat, response, and survival. The broader impact of the Ottoman advance was felt across all levels of Wallachian society. The boyars, whose ambitions might have been unrestrained in calmer times, were compelled to consider the consequences of external threat in their political calculations. Villagers and townspeople, witnessing the preparation and mobilization of the principality, internalized both a sense of danger and a recognition of the necessity of compliance with the ruler's directives. Vlad III's early efforts to restore order, enforce taxation, and suppress corruption were thus inseparable from the looming Ottoman presence, with the spectre of invasion reinforcing both authority and the demand for disciplined governance. Through careful observation, preparation, and strategic foresight, Vlad III navigated Wallachia's position in the shadow of Mehmed Tisami's expanding empire. His understanding of the Sultan's objectives, the psychological impact of the Ottoman military, and the strategic importance of geography informed his policies, military measures, and administrative decisions. Wallachia existed at the intersection of ambition, threat, and opportunity, and Vlad's leadership reflected the integration of these forces into a coherent, if cautious, approach to survival and sovereignty. Thus, the advance of Mehmed Tisami's and the Ottoman Empire cast a long and pervasive shadow over Wallachia. The principality, already marked by internal turbulence and the legacy of severe governance, now faced the added dimension of external pressure from one of the most formidable military powers of the age. Vlad III's responses, strategic, meticulous, and informed by both fear and calculation, demonstrated an acute awareness of the stakes involved, shaping not only the military and diplomatic history of the region, but the enduring legacy of a ruler whose authority was forged in the delicate balance between internal order and external threat. The night over Targovichet was enveloped in a quiet darkness, the kind that settles over the rolling hills and scattered forests of Wallachia, bringing with it a sense of stillness that both concealed and heightened the presence of those who moved beneath its cover. Vlad III, having established the defensive and administrative structures of his principality and withstanding the persistent shadow of the Ottoman advance, faced a moment where strategy, landscape, and the careful orchestration of movement converged. In the deep hours before dawn, the forests and the folds of the land became instruments in a deliberate maneuver, a calculated exertion of psychological pressure upon the advancing Ottoman forces that extended far beyond mere combat, emphasizing anticipation, perception, and the careful projection of authority. The planning of the nocturnal raid was methodical, informed by Vlad's intimate knowledge of both the terrain and the psychology of his enemy. The hills surrounding Targovichet, their slopes interspersed with dense groves, streams, and hidden clearings, offered natural cover and routes for silent movement. Vlad's forces, composed of local militias and loyal retainers well versed in the habits of the land, moved deliberately through these spaces, their footsteps muffled against the earth, their positions calculated to exploit both the darkness and the uneven ground. The Ottomans, encamped in the valley below, were unaware of the approaching presence, their attention divided between the immediate maintenance of the camp and the broader anticipation of conflict. a tension that Vlad sought to manipulate with precision. The slow, deliberate movement of his forces reflected a philosophy of warfare that emphasized control, observation, and the anticipation of enemy response over immediate engagement. Scouts reported positions and patrol patterns. Small units tested the reactions of the sentries without revealing their true numbers or intent, and every step was taken with an awareness of the surrounding forests, the scent of smoke from distant fires, and the faint sounds of nocturnal wildlife that could mask or betray movement. In this environment, the land itself was a participant in strategy, shaping both the execution and the perception of the operation. Vlad's objective was not to achieve sudden slaughter, but to create a psychological impression of omnipresence, unpredictability, and the inevitability of resistance. Small detachments moved along multiple routes simultaneously, generating confusion and uncertainty among the Ottoman forces. The sounds of movement, carefully orchestrated to suggest a larger presence than was actually there, combined with the dim glow of torches placed in patterns to suggest encirclement, created a landscape that communicated both danger and inevitability. In the darkness, the distinction between actual force and perceived threat blurred, a principle Vlad understood intuitively, having observed the power of fear as a governing and strategic instrument during his own years in Ottoman captivity and his early rule. The encampment itself, sprawling across the lowlands below Targovishte, was vulnerable not merely in terms of physical defense but in psychological structure. Soldiers, unfamiliar with the landscape and dependent upon routine for both security and coordination, were susceptible to misdirection and confusion. Vlad's forces exploited this vulnerability, moving with a deliberate slowness, ensuring that the Ottoman commanders could not immediately assess the scale, direction, or nature of the threat. Every step, every rustle of movement through the forest, was magnified by the darkness, the topography, and the anticipation of engagement, producing a heightened state of alertness that rendered the enemy increasingly reactive rather than proactive. The raid unfolded over several hours, measured by the careful, deliberate execution of maneuver rather than the clamor of combat. Units positioned along approaches to key tent clusters and river crossings generated pressure through noise, shadows, and limited skirmishes, each action reinforcing the perception of encirclement and control. Vlad himself, aware of both the psychological and strategic dimensions of the operation, maintained coordination through messengers and signals, ensuring that the movement of forces remained synchronized while the overall presence appeared larger, more fluid, and less predictable than it actually was. The natural features of Targovishte, the gentle inclines, scattered groves, and winding paths, were not merely obstacles but tools, carefully incorporated into the design of the night raid. Forests provided concealment, while clearings allowed for calculated demonstrations of force that could be observed from within the camp, amplifying the sense of threat. Streams and small elevations became vantage points for observation and coordination, while narrow passes channeled potential enemy movement into predictable patterns. In this careful use of terrain, Vlad's strategy reflected an understanding of the environment as an active participant in military operations, shaping both perception and decision-making on both sides. The psychological effect on the Ottoman forces was profound, though indirect. By the time dawn approached, confusion and apprehension had spread across the camp. Soldiers, uncertain of the number and disposition of enemy units, responded defensively rather than offensively. Commanders, attempting to maintain order amidst the uncertainty, found their authority undermined by the persistent perception of encirclement. Even without large-scale engagement, the night raid imposed a form of control that extended beyond the immediate battlefield, demonstrating Vlad's capacity to exert influence through strategy, observation, and the manipulation of environmental and psychological factors. The aftermath of the raid reinforced these effects. While casualties may have been limited relative to conventional battle, the perception of Vlad's omnipresence persisted, echoing through the valleys, forests, and villages surrounding Targovishte. Reports of the night operation traveled quickly, carried by both Ottoman messengers and Wallachian observers, embedding a narrative of unpredictability, strategy, and calculated resistance. For neighboring principalities and allied forces, the operation served as both a cautionary tale and a demonstration of tactical acumen, a reinforcement of Vlad's authority and capability in the wider regional context. In this way, the night attack at Targovishte exemplified Vlad III's approach to governance and warfare as interwoven practices. The principles underlying the raid, deliberation, careful observation, manipulation of perception, and the integration of psychological pressure into tactical execution, were extensions of the methods he had applied internally, including administrative reforms, strict justice, and public demonstrations of authority. The same attention to detail, coordination, and strategic projection that had shaped his governance of Wallachia now manifested in military action, reinforcing the continuity between domestic control and defense against external threats. Through this careful orchestration of movement, landscape, and perception, Vlad III transformed the natural darkness and geography of Targovishte into instruments of strategy. The night raid was less an event of sudden violence than a prolonged, deliberate exercise in anticipation, observation, and the projection of authority. By moving slowly, deliberately, and with awareness of both terrain and psychology, Vlad communicated power in a manner that extended far beyond the immediate reach of his forces, demonstrating that governance, strategy, and fear were intertwined, and that the boundaries of influence could be shaped as effectively by perception as by the clash of armies. The operation left the principality and its ruler in a position of reinforced authority, demonstrating to both internal and external observers that Wallachia could withstand the shadow of Ottoman expansion, not merely through force, but through deliberate, strategic calculation. The night attack at Targovishte thus became both a historical episode of resistance and a reflection of Vlad's broader philosophy that power, order, and survival depended as much upon careful planning, observation, and psychological control as upon the immediate application of physical force. Despite the carefully orchestrated displays of authority, the strict administration of law, and the tactical brilliance demonstrated in campaigns such as the night raid at Targovishte, the passage of time and the shifting currents of regional politics began to erode the foundation of Vlad III's power. The Principality of Wallachia, ever precariously balanced between the ambitions of larger empires and the rivalries of local factions, was vulnerable not only to external pressures, but to the subtle erosion of authority from within. Long-term governance, particularly in a context defined by continuous military tension and the pervasive shadow of the Ottoman Empire, required not only strategic brilliance and rigorous enforcement, but also resilience in the face of attrition, the patience to navigate shifting alliances, and the foresight to counter the latent threats of betrayal, factors that increasingly strained the reach of Vlad's control. The prolonged campaigns against Ottoman forces, interspersed with forays against rival claimants and rebellious boyars, exacted a cumulative toll upon Wallachia. Military readiness, while reinforced by rigorous taxation and disciplined administration, faced inevitable limitations as resources were expended and replenishment became a constant concern. Each engagement, whether a skirmish, a raid, or a defensive positioning, required careful planning, sustained effort, and coordination across a landscape that was as challenging as it was strategically significant. Over time, the constant exertion required of both leadership and the population began to strain the bonds of loyalty and the capacity for compliance, revealing the delicate balance between authority and exhaustion that underpinned Vlad's rule. Shifting alliances among Wallachian boyars further complicated the situation. The very measures that had allowed Vlad to consolidate power, rigorous enforcement of law, suppression of corruption, and visible punishment of transgressors, also generated resentment and fear among those whose traditional privileges were curtailed. While fear could enforce compliance, it did not guarantee enduring loyalty, and the boyars' ambitions persisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes in open opposition. Internal dissent was exacerbated by the ongoing external pressures of the Ottoman Empire, as neighboring powers and foreign interests sought to manipulate internal divisions to their advantage, creating a complex and dynamic political landscape that Vlad had to navigate with constant vigilance. The cumulative effect of these pressures was further intensified by the unpredictable nature of regional diplomacy. Wallachia's position between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire necessitated careful negotiation, tribute payments, and strategic posturing. Each alliance, however carefully considered, was contingent upon the stability of neighboring powers and the shifting objectives of rulers whose priorities were often fluid and opportunistic. Vlad's reliance on calculated diplomacy was therefore continually challenged by the volatility of the political environment, which could render carefully constructed strategies ineffective in the face of unforeseen shifts in allegiance, rebellion, or invasion. Betrayal, both perceived and actual, compounded the difficulties faced by Vlad III. The boyars, whose influence had been constrained, but not entirely extinguished, occasionally conspired with external powers or sought to exploit moments of weakness. Intelligence networks, while employed with meticulous attention, could not fully anticipate the subtle maneuvers of those who had long practiced the art of political survival within Wallachia's fractious society. These internal fractures, often amplified by external incentives, gradually weakened the cohesion of Vlad's administration, eroding the certainty of compliance that had once allowed him to govern with both discipline and fear. Economic pressures added a further layer of complexity. Prolonged military campaigns, combined with the enforcement of taxation and anti-corruption measures, placed substantial demands upon the population. Peasants, soldiers, and townspeople were required to contribute resources, labor, and obedience over sustained periods, testing the limits of endurance and patience. While the administrative reforms had strengthened the collection of tribute and the allocation of resources for both governance and defense, the cumulative effect of continuous demands inevitably generated strains in social cohesion. Compliance was enforced, but the human capacity for sustained submission under duress proved finite, revealing another dimension of vulnerability in Vlad's hold over the principality. In addition to these internal and external pressures, the broader geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe remained dynamic and unpredictable. Neighboring principalities, foreign powers, and distant empires all exerted influence through diplomatic engagement, military threat, and economic incentives, shaping the choices available to Vlad III. Even as his tactical successes, such as the nocturnal operations at Targovishte, reinforced his reputation for strategic brilliance, the cumulative effect of ongoing threats gradually eroded the latitude within which he could operate. Authority, while meticulously projected through both governance and fear, was continually challenged by factors that extended beyond his immediate control. The interplay between these forces, internal dissent, economic strain, prolonged military engagement, and the unpredictability of regional politics, created a gradual but inexorable weakening of Vlad's position. Each element, while manageable in isolation, combined over time to introduce vulnerabilities that could be exploited by both internal and external actors. The very measures that had solidified his authority in earlier years, the enforcement of law, the display of punishment, the projection of strategic strength, became paradoxically sources of tension and fatigue, highlighting the delicate balance between coercion, governance, and sustainability in a principality beset by constant challenge. Despite these challenges, Vlad III continued to exercise authority with precision and calculation. The lessons of earlier campaigns, the meticulous attention to administration, and the projection of fear as a strategic instrument, were not abandoned. However, the cumulative pressures of prolonged warfare, the shifting loyalties of the boyars, and the constant threat of Ottoman intervention gradually undermined the unassailable position that had once defined his rule. Tactical brilliance and strategic foresight remained evident, but they operated within a narrower margin for error, and the uncertainties of internal and external pressures increasingly limited the effectiveness of previously successful measures. In this period of waning power, the narrative of Vlad III becomes one of tension between achievement and vulnerability. The administrative reforms, military successes, and psychological strategies that had defined his early years were counterbalanced by the exhaustion of resources, the ambivalence of allies, and the persistent unpredictability of external pressures. Authority, while still formidable, required constant reinforcement through both action and perception, and even minor miscalculations had the potential to reverberate across the principality. The dynamic interplay of these factors illustrates the fragility inherent in a system of governance built upon fear, discipline, and the careful orchestration of compliance, revealing the limits of power even for a ruler of exceptional skill and determination. Through this lens, the waning of Vlad III's power is not merely a narrative of decline, but an exploration of the complex interplay between internal governance, external threat, and the human limitations of both ruler and ruled. The pressures of prolonged war, shifting alliances, and internal betrayal gradually eroded the certainty of authority, demonstrating that even the most disciplined, fearsome, and strategically adept leadership is subject to the inexorable forces of circumstance, fatigue, and political unpredictability. In this way, Vlad's later years of rule reflect both the resilience and vulnerability of power, the delicate balance between authority and obedience, and the subtle, often imperceptible ways in which influence can wane even amid the legacy of previous brilliance. The years following Vlad III's waning power were marked by a profound shift in the texture of his life, a transformation from the relentless projection of authority across Wallachia to a period defined by stillness, confinement, and the quiet pressures of observation and restraint. Arrested by King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary around 1462, Vlad's captivity took him across the Danube into lands that, though politically aligned with European Christendom, offered no immediate threat to the empire that had once shadowed his principality. The arrest itself, motivated by shifting alliances, internal intrigue, and the complex web of diplomacy that connected Wallachia, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, removed him from the landscape he had governed so meticulously, placing him instead within the cool, ordered confines of Hungarian authority, where time assumed a slower, more reflective cadence, and the outward exertions of power were replaced by the quiet calculations of endurance. The physical environment of captivity, whether within stone chambers, austere castles, or guarded estates, imposed an atmosphere both controlled and constraining. The architecture, often massive, shadowed, and deliberately isolated, served as a constant reminder of the physical and political boundaries imposed upon him. Light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across walls and floors, emphasizing the separation from the landscapes and populations he had once influenced directly. Within these spaces, daily routines were dictated by the rhythms of the captors rather than by the agency of the prisoner, and every action, movement along corridors, interaction with attendants, observation of the surrounding grounds was mediated by a conscious awareness of surveillance and constraint. In such an environment, the projection of fear and authority that had defined his earlier years could no longer be exercised outwardly, replaced instead by a form of internalized discipline and reflection that shaped the psychological texture of the period. The routines of captivity, though often monotonous, were suffused with subtle psychological tension. Vlad's awareness of the political stakes surrounding his imprisonment remained acute. Every messenger, visitor, or external report could carry implications for both the fate of Wallachia and his own future influence. The days unfolded in quiet patterns, yet each was underpinned by a sense of suspended potential, a recognition that action had been replaced by observation, and that influence, previously immediate and tactile, now relied upon the patient management of perception, reputation, and strategic patience. The psychological landscape of captivity, marked by constraint and the absence of direct authority, created a space in which reflection, endurance, and careful assessment became essential tools of survival. Interactions with attendants, guards, and visiting diplomats were carefully measured. Conversations were often perfunctory, yet each exchange carried the potential for insight, subtle persuasion, or the observation of shifting political winds. Vlad, accustomed to commanding attention through fear and meticulous administration, now experienced the reversal of these dynamics, in which attention was granted conditionally and influence was indirect. The rhythm of captivity, defined by measured observation, intermittent reports from Wallachia, and the occasional arrival of emissaries, created a slow, contemplative tempo in which each moment of perception became heightened in significance. The long duration of imprisonment intensified the psychological landscape. Days and weeks merged into months, and months into years, producing a continuity of quiet, punctuated by the rare intrusion of news or interaction. The boundaries of time were both imposed and internalized, as the prisoner became attuned to the rhythms of the castle, the cycles of seasons observed from narrow windows, and the gradual shifts in the external political environment as it affected the possibility of release or return. Within this monotony, a detached awareness took root, a conscious observation of both self and circumstance, in which the immediate exertions of power were replaced by patience, endurance, and the slow assessment of external events beyond his reach. Vlad's internal discipline during captivity can be understood as both a response to and a product of this environment. Deprived of the ability to project authority outwardly, he cultivated a form of resilience that relied upon mental acuity, patience, and the careful monitoring of information. Knowledge of Wallachia's ongoing political developments, the maneuvers of boyars, and the ambitions of neighboring powers became a form of mental engagement, a way to maintain relevance and strategic awareness even in the absence of physical agency. The slow, measured observation of these dynamics, combined with reflection upon prior decisions and experiences, created a contemplative rhythm in which the projection of power was replaced by the internal exercise of discipline, insight, and anticipation. The passage of time in captivity also allowed for the emergence of a certain detachment from immediate emotion. The initial anger, frustration, or desire for vengeance that might have accompanied the arrest gradually gave way to a reflective observation of the currents shaping both personal and political realities. In this suspended state, the awareness of past decisions, the consequences of past actions, and the persistent weight of reputation became central to the experience of imprisonment. Vlad's capacity for patience, informed by years of strategic thinking and survival under pressure, allowed him to endure the monotony, isolation, and limitations of captivity with a composure that was itself a reflection of the discipline which had characterized his earlier governance. The external political landscape continued to shift even as Vlad remained physically constrained. Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Wallachia's internal factions all navigated a fluid interplay of power, tribute, and diplomacy, creating a situation in which the implications of the imprisonment were continually evolving. Each report, each letter, and each subtle shift in the disposition of foreign powers held significance for the eventual possibility of release, return, or renewed engagement with Wallachian politics. Vlad's attention to these slow-moving currents, the careful assimilation of information, and the anticipation of opportunities reflected an enduring strategic acumen, even within the physical and psychological limitations imposed by imprisonment. The atmosphere of these years was defined by quiet observation, deliberate pacing, and the internal cultivation of resilience. Whereas previous periods of his life had involved the direct projection of power through administration, punishment, and military strategy, captivity required the adaptation of these skills to a context in which influence was indirect and agency constrained. The passage of time became both a challenge and a tool, allowing for reflection upon the consolidation of authority, the consequences of earlier actions, and the subtle management of perception and reputation that could influence external actors even while physically removed from the center of power. In this way, Vlad III's captivity beyond the Danube was a period marked less by visible action than by psychological endurance, patient observation, and the careful calibration of awareness. The confinement, isolation, and monotony of imprisonment created a slow, almost meditative tempo in which time itself was a component of strategy, and perception, patience, and reflection became primary instruments of engagement with both the external world and the internal self. These years, detached from the immediate exertions of power, yet saturated with awareness of ongoing political dynamics, represent a distinct chapter in Vlad's life, illustrating the capacity of resilience, patience, and strategic contemplation in shaping both survival and legacy. After years of isolation and observation from his confinement beyond the Danube, Vlad III eventually emerged from captivity, released under circumstances shaped by the shifting currents of diplomacy, political necessity, and the subtle machinations of both Hungarian and Wallachian elites. The moment of release was not marked by sudden triumph or jubilant return, but by a slow, measured reintegration into a landscape that had changed in his absence. The forests, rivers, and towns of Wallachia, once intimately familiar, now bore traces of time, neglect, and new governance. Similarly, the broader Balkan landscape reflected the transformations wrought by ongoing Ottoman expansion, intermittent local rebellions, and the strategic recalibrations of regional powers, leaving Vlad to navigate a terrain both familiar and subtly altered, where past experience would inform but not guarantee immediate control. Vlad's release, facilitated in part by alliances with influential figures within the Hungarian court, involved the careful negotiation of political and familial obligations. Marriage into Hungarian nobility provided not only a social reintegration, but also a subtle reinforcement of political alignment, creating a network of obligations, loyalties, and surveillance that extended both opportunity and constraint. The act of entering this social structure was neither abrupt nor superficial. It involved sustained adaptation to the norms, expectations, and social rhythms of the Hungarian elite, blending ceremonial, domestic, and political responsibilities into a continuous process of observation, negotiation, and strategic positioning. In this sense, release was not simply freedom, but the beginning of a deliberate recalibration of authority, influence, and positioning within the shifting networks of power in Central and Southeastern Europe. The cultural and political environment that Vlad encountered upon release had evolved significantly during his years of imprisonment. Hungarian administration, Ottoman pressure, and the ambitions of regional boyars had each contributed to a landscape of realigned loyalties, newly fortified positions, and altered social hierarchies. Towns and fortresses were reinforced, some local leaders had asserted greater autonomy, and the habits of tribute and allegiance had adjusted to accommodate both external threat and internal negotiation. Vlad's return, therefore, required both a reassessment of past strategies and a careful application of authority, integrating the lessons of confinement with the practical realities of a principality that had endured and adapted in his absence. Marriage into Hungarian nobility brought with it a subtle form of social and political conversion, embedding Vlad into the ceremonial and strategic networks of the region. Through these familial connections, he gained both protection and influence, allowing a measured return to political engagement while reinforcing alignment with a European Christian framework that intersected with, yet remained distinct from, the pressures of Ottoman proximity. These relationships were not merely personal but political instruments, creating channels for negotiation, intelligence gathering, and the projection of influence across borders, reinforcing Vlad's capacity to act strategically within a complex, interdependent network of regional powers. The Balkan landscape he returned to had also undergone strategic, demographic, and military transformation. Ottoman expansion continued to press along the Danube and into neighboring principalities, creating new patterns of vassalage, tribute, and military obligation. Fortresses once weakened by neglect had been restored, new alliances had shifted the balance of influence among local lords, and the rhythms of trade, communication, and military readiness had been recalibrated to accommodate both the pressures of external threat and the ambitions of local elites. For Vlad, this meant that the exercise of power required both adaptation and foresight, blending familiarity with observation, memory with the careful assessment of contemporary realities, and assertiveness with patience. The temporal distance created by imprisonment also altered Vlad's relationship to power itself. Whereas previous years had been dominated by immediate enforcement, displays of authority, and the strategic use of fear, the years of confinement had cultivated a form of psychological resilience and observation that emphasized the measurement of influence, the anticipation of threat, and the patient orchestration of opportunity. Release did not immediately restore the capacity for unilateral control. It demanded a careful reintegration, a renewed assessment of loyalties, and the deliberate projection of authority in a context where the landscape, both physical and political, had shifted subtly but profoundly. The interplay between internal governance, external diplomacy, and personal positioning became central to Vlad's renewed strategy. Hungarian patronage, marital alliances, and local observation provided channels through which influence could be exercised indirectly, while the continued threat of Ottoman expansion necessitated vigilance, preparedness, and the capacity to integrate military, administrative, and psychological measures. In this sense, Vlad's return was not a simple restoration of previous power, but a nuanced recalibration, requiring the synthesis of experience gained during captivity with the practical and symbolic realities of a Balkan landscape transformed by time, conflict, and human ambition. Vlad's approach to this changed world was both cautious and deliberate. Actions, whether in administration, military preparation, or social negotiation, were executed with attention to timing, perception, and consequence. Local leaders and foreign emissaries alike were observed carefully, their behavior catalogued and interpreted within a broader understanding of loyalty, ambition, and political opportunity. The integration of insight gained during years of quiet observation into the practical exercise of authority exemplified a measured, almost contemplative form of governance, in which patience, perception, and strategic calculation were as essential as enforcement, intimidation, or physical control. The marriage alliance, while personally and socially significant, also functioned as a stabilizing instrument in the context of regional volatility. It offered a framework through which Vlad could negotiate influence, secure logistical and diplomatic support, and project legitimacy within networks that extended beyond the borders of Wallachia. In these alliances, personal, political, and strategic dimensions intertwined, reflecting the complex reality of power in a region where geography, diplomacy, and military capability were inseparable from the intricate web of human relationships that defined authority. As the landscape of the Balkans continued to shift around him, Vlad III's renewed engagement demonstrated an awareness of both continuity and change. The forests, rivers, and towns of Wallachia, familiar yet subtly altered, served as both symbols and instruments of authority. His strategic recalibration reflected an understanding that power could not be projected solely through force or fear, but required integration with diplomacy, social positioning, and the careful observation of evolving realities. In this way, release and reintegration were less a return to previous patterns of rule than a deliberate adaptation to a world transformed by absence, negotiation, and the slow pressures of time. Ultimately, this period illustrates the delicate interplay between freedom, influence, and the mutable conditions of the world beyond immediate control. Vlad III's release, facilitated through alliance, marriage, and the strategic calculation of both Hungarian and Wallachian actors, marked a transition from enforced stillness to measured engagement. It required the integration of experience, observation, and adaptability, allowing him to navigate a Balkan landscape reshaped by the passage of years, the ambitions of empires, and the shifting loyalties of those around him. In this atmosphere of patient reintegration, the slow, deliberate exercise of authority emerged as both necessity and strategy, setting the stage for the continuation of Vlad's legacy within a world defined as much by change and contingency as by the enduring patterns of fear, discipline, and governance that had previously characterized his rule. Vlad III's years of patient observation, strategic alliance, and cautious reintegration into the shifting political landscape of the Balkans culminated in a final, deliberate attempt to reclaim the Wallachian throne, a campaign defined by meticulous planning, awareness of fragile loyalties, and the enduring complexities of a principality riven by factionalism and external pressures. The task before him was not merely to assert personal claim, but to navigate a landscape deeply fractured by boyar rivalries, the lingering influence of Ottoman power, and the shifting allegiances imposed by Hungarian and regional actors. In approaching this campaign, Vlad drew upon decades of experience, integrating lessons from governance, psychological strategy, and the careful projection of authority into a methodical plan for temporary restoration. The political divisions that Vlad confronted were manifold and persistent. Within Wallachia, boyars who had endured his earlier reign, or had benefited from periods of absence, maintained localized power structures that were resistant to centralization. Some were motivated by personal ambition, others by the opportunity to align with foreign powers, and yet others by the inertia of tradition in a landscape where authority had always been contingent and fragile. External powers compounded these divisions. The Ottoman Empire maintained an interest in ensuring a compliant vassal, while the Kingdom of Hungary continued to maneuver strategically, balancing support for Vlad against other claimants and against the broader calculus of Balkan politics. These intersecting pressures required that the campaign be executed with a precision that blended diplomacy, military preparedness, and psychological acumen. Vlad's approach to this final campaign emphasized a combination of symbolic authority, visible enforcement, and strategic engagement with both allies and opponents. Armies, assembled from loyalists, regional militias, and carefully negotiated forces, moved deliberately through the Wallachian landscape. Each movement was calculated, measured to demonstrate capability without provoking premature resistance or alerting opposing factions before positions were secured. Towns and fortresses were approached with attention to both geography and perception, ensuring that loyalty could be reinforced and opposition neutralized before the consolidation of authority could be challenged. The campaign was less an abrupt assault than a series of coordinated maneuvers, each intended to gradually restore influence while minimizing unnecessary confrontation and disruption. The temporal rhythm of the campaign reflected a careful balance between urgency and patience. Vlad was acutely aware that rapid, uncoordinated movements could expose vulnerabilities or provoke fragmentation among supporters, while overly slow action risked allowing opponents to consolidate. Decisions regarding march routes, encampments, and engagements with local populations were informed by reconnaissance, historical knowledge of loyalties, and an understanding of the psychological impact of presence. The landscape itself, the winding rivers, rolling hills, and dense forests that had shaped prior campaigns, became both ally and instrument, allowing controlled demonstrations of strength, the monitoring of potential threats, and the management of perception across a broad geographic canvas. The psychological dimension of the campaign was particularly significant. Vlad had long understood that the projection of authority could be as influential as the physical exercise of force. Displays of organizational capability, the careful positioning of loyal forces, and the deliberate reinforcement of symbols of legitimacy, fortifications, banners, and proclamations were intended to cultivate both obedience and awe. Boyars, villagers, and neighboring actors alike were positioned as witnesses to the reassertion of authority, their perception shaped by the careful orchestration of movement, timing, and visible discipline. Even in temporary restoration, the strategic management of reputation was inseparable from the exercise of power. Resistance, where it occurred, was addressed with the same combination of calculation and severity that had characterized Vlad's earlier governance. Opponents who openly challenged authority were met with methods that were precise, deliberate, and designed to serve as both correction and deterrent. Local factions, skeptical observers, and potential defectors were integrated into the broader projection of order, with consequences meted out in a manner that reinforced loyalty while signaling the limits of permissible dissent. These measures were less reactive than proactive, reflecting a sustained understanding of the dynamics between perception, fear, and obedience within a population conditioned by decades of political uncertainty. The brief period of restored authority highlighted both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Vlad's approach. Control was re-established across strategic areas, fortresses were reinforced, and the network of boyar compliance was recalibrated. At the same time, the underlying fragility of the principality remained evident. External pressures from the Ottomans continued to loom, the ambitions of internal factions persisted, and the logistical and human constraints of sustained governance were apparent. Vlad's return to power was a demonstration of both skill and limitation, illustrating the delicate balance required to maintain authority in a principality constantly threatened by both internal division and external ambition. Throughout this campaign, Vlad's awareness of temporality and consequence was acute. Every action, whether the positioning of troops, the issuance of directives, or the enforcement of discipline, was executed with an understanding of both immediate effect and longer-term perception. The consolidation of authority, even briefly, depended not only on the physical presence of forces, but on the cultivation of confidence, fear, and recognition across multiple strata of society. The campaign demonstrated the integration of governance, military strategy, and psychological projection, illustrating the continuity of Vlad's approach even after years of imprisonment and political uncertainty. Ultimately, the final campaign for Wallachia was characterized by both deliberate precision and temporal limitation. The reclamation of the throne, while significant, was provisional, shaped by the enduring complexities of internal rivalries, external pressures, and the fragile endurance of political loyalty. Vlad's actions during this period reflect the careful calibration of authority, the integration of prior experience into practical decision-making, and the recognition that power, in a context defined by both opportunity and vulnerability, is contingent, negotiated, and always subject to the shifting currents of circumstance. The restoration, brief as it was, allowed Vlad III to reassert a measure of influence, reinforce his reputation for strategic acumen and severity, and implement measures that reflected the accumulated lessons of his previous reigns, imprisonment, and observation of the Balkan political landscape. In this final effort to consolidate power, he navigated the interplay of geography, loyalty, perception, and military capability with deliberate care, producing a moment of reasserted authority that, while temporary, exemplified the persistent integration of experience, strategy, and psychological insight that had characterized his life. Thus, Vlad's final campaign for Wallachia was a testament to both his resilience and the enduring limitations of rule in a principality perpetually defined by internal division, external threat, and the delicate balance between authority and perception. It was a period in which past experience informed present action, strategic calculation merged with psychological projection, and the brief restoration of power was shaped as much by careful orchestration and observation as by physical control or military engagement. The closing chapters of Vlad III's life unfolded not in the grandeur of courtly ceremony or the deliberate orchestration of strategic campaigns, but amid the quiet inevitability of conflict and the diffuse dispersal of those who had once surrounded him with loyalty and fear. The final battle in which he participated, occurring in the contested borderlands of Wallachia and Moldavia, was marked by an understated tension, a measured awareness of danger, and the gradual accumulation of consequences that had been set in motion by decades of political turbulence. Vlad's death, enveloped in both uncertainty and speculation, was less a dramatic crescendo than a quiet, almost inevitable termination of a life defined by the sustained exertion of authority, discipline, and the deliberate projection of power across landscapes, both internal and external. The circumstances surrounding this last engagement are recorded with varying accounts, reflecting both the limitations of contemporary documentation and the enduring mystique that had begun to attach itself to Vlad's persona. Some sources suggest that he fell in ambush at the hands of Wallachian boyars aligned with Hungarian or Ottoman interests, while others place his death amid the broader context of border skirmishes in which loyalties shifted unpredictably and forces moved in the quiet shadow of mountains, rivers, and forests. In each version, however, there is a commonality of effect. Vlad's life, previously marked by active orchestration of events, concludes in a manner that underscores the subtle interplay of agency, circumstance, and the inherent fragility of political power in a region defined by volatility. The battlefield itself, whether a narrow pass, a forested clearing, or an open plain, played a role in shaping the final act. Vlad, familiar with the strategic qualities of Wallachian geography, had consistently leveraged terrain, forests and rivers to project authority and manage both internal and external threats. Yet in this ultimate engagement, the landscape became a neutral witness rather than an instrument of control. Shadows of trees, undulating hills, and the slow movement of troops created a rhythm that contrasted with the immediacy of death, producing an atmosphere in which the culmination of years of strategy and enforcement converged quietly into a final measured dispersion of forces. The departure of Vlad III from active life was accompanied by the gradual dispersal of his followers. Loyalists, aware of the uncertainty surrounding the battle and the absence of their central figure of authority, began to retreat in an orderly, almost ritualized manner, moving along routes that had long been known to those familiar with the terrain. The movement of these troops was not frantic or chaotic, but deliberate, reflecting a continuity of discipline even in the face of loss, and illustrating the long-standing connection between Vlad's leadership style and the organizational habits instilled within his retainers. The quiet withdrawal of forces left the land temporarily vacant of the intense, deliberate presence that had characterized his earlier campaigns, creating an emptiness that was both tangible and symbolic. Accounts of the exact moment of Vlad's death vary, and their ambiguity contributes to the reflective, contemplative atmosphere surrounding this period. Some chronicles suggest that he fell in combat, struck by opponents within a skirmish or ambush, while other narratives imply that betrayal or circumstantial misfortune played a role. Regardless of the precise mechanism, the overarching tone is one of inevitability rather than drama. A life spent in constant engagement with forces, both human and political, culminates in a quiet cessation. A cessation whose significance is measured not in spectacle but in the enduring shadow it casts over both the principality and the memory of those who witnessed or later recounted his actions. The dispersal of loyalists, while measured and methodical, also marked a transition in Wallachian governance. Without the central presence of the voivode, local power structures adjusted to fill the void. Boyars reasserted influence where it had been constrained. External powers recalibrated their strategies of alliance and oversight, and the rhythms of tribute, taxation and administration resumed a cadence shaped less by the deliberate orchestration of a single figure and more by the diffuse negotiated authority of regional actors. Vlad's absence created a vacuum that highlighted both the extent of his prior control and the fragility of power dependent upon individual presence, skill, and reputation. The ambient landscape reflected the subtlety of this transition. Forests, hills, and rivers that had once been instruments of strategic projection and psychological influence became quiet witnesses to the unfolding dispersal. Villages, towns, and fortifications, long under the direct imprint of Vlad's authority, adjusted to the absence of his immediate presence, reasserting patterns of daily life and local governance while internalizing the psychological residue of decades-long control. The environment, previously a canvas for strategic manipulation, became a neutral space, preserving traces of past exertions while accommodating the emergent realities of leadership transition. Historical records, whether from Ottoman chroniclers, Hungarian sources, or local Wallachian accounts, converge upon a recognition of the subtlety and finality of Vlad's departure. There is no singular moment of triumph or spectacle. Instead, the narrative emphasizes the quiet cessation of action, the inevitable unfolding of consequences, and the enduring influence of past decisions upon both followers and opponents. The measured tone of these accounts underscores the reflective dimension of Vlad's life, the same patience, observation, and strategic awareness that shaped his campaigns and governance extend in a sense into the posthumous narrative, framing his fall as a component of the broader dynamics that defined the principality and the region. The quiet dispersal of his forces and the ambiguity surrounding the specifics of death further contributed to the creation of legend. The absence of dramatic clarity allowed later generations to interpret, embellish, and mythologize events in ways that emphasize both horror and admiration. Yet at the temporal moment itself, The atmosphere remained calm, detached and defined by the slow, deliberate rhythms of strategic withdrawal, observation and the recalibration of loyalty in response to sudden absence. Vlad's final act, therefore, is as much a reflection of continuity, discipline, careful observation and strategic awareness as it is a conclusion, illustrating the interplay of individual action and the inevitability of historical circumstance. Through this lens, the last battle and the fall of Vlad III can be understood not merely as the violent termination of a life, but as a quiet transition in which authority, loyalty, and memory intersect. The immediacy of combat, the dispersal of retainers, and the silent observation of the surrounding landscape converge into a reflective tableau in which the end of presence is accompanied by the persistence of influence, psychological residue, and strategic consequence. The measured, calm recounting of these events emphasizes the continuity of Vlad's methods, the fragility inherent in centralized power, and the subtle ways in which authority extends beyond the immediate exercise of force. Vlad III's passing, enveloped in uncertainty, and the slow dispersal of his followers, marks the conclusion of an era defined by deliberate enforcement, strategic calculation, and the intricate interplay of fear, loyalty, and governance. The quiet rhythm of retreat, observation, and the adjustment of power structures underscores the persistent interplay between individual action and broader structural forces, illustrating the nuanced dynamics that shaped both his life and the legacy that followed. Following the quiet dispersal of Vlad III's forces and the uncertain conclusion of his final battle, Wallachia entered a period of transition characterized by a subtle but persistent instability that emanated from both the absence of a central authority figure and the relentless pressures imposed by neighboring powers. The principality, long dependent upon the precise orchestration of loyalty, fear, and governance that Vlad had cultivated over decades, now found itself navigating a delicate balance between internal factionalism and external oversight. Boyars, who had once operated under the stringent enforcement of Vlad's rule, reassessed their positions, recalibrating alliances and asserting influence over territories and fortifications with measured caution, as though aware of both opportunity and the fragility of emerging structures in the absence of a unifying figure. The political landscape immediately following Vlad's death reflected a rapid reconfiguration of power. Competing claimants, whether from the broader Dracula lineage or from rival families, vied for control with varying degrees of success, while Hungarian and Ottoman actors continued to exert influence over Wallachian affairs, seeking either the placement of compliant rulers or the manipulation of local factions to maintain stability favorable to their interests. The resulting environment was one of quiet negotiation, subtle pressure, and intermittent conflict, in which authority was provisional, loyalties were conditional, and the memory of past enforcement remained an underlying influence, shaping both compliance and resistance in equal measure. Within this power vacuum, the boyars became principal actors, navigating the fractured hierarchy to secure local control and influence over strategic fortresses and villages. Their behavior reflected the accumulated lessons of years under Vlad's regime, a cautious recognition of the potential consequences of defiance, tempered by the awareness that the absence of a strong central authority provided opportunities for greater autonomy. The resultant landscape of governance was diffuse, characterized by a series of microcosms in which local authority, historical alliances, and the rhythms of tribute and taxation defined patterns of influence in a manner distinct from the tightly coordinated systems of Vlad's earlier rule. The continuing pressure of the Ottoman Empire provided a constant external dimension to these internal dynamics. The Sultan's ambitions in the Balkans focused on the maintenance of tributary relationships and the expansion of influence across principalities, ensured that Wallachia remained a theatre of strategic significance. Ottoman envoys, garrisons, and emissaries influenced the decisions of local leaders, shaping allegiances and ensuring that the principality's autonomy was constrained by a broader geopolitical framework. In this context, the absence of Vlad's direct authority amplified the sense of vulnerability, underscoring the persistent tension between local ambition and external control that had defined much of his earlier reign. The social and psychological effects of Vlad's death were subtle yet enduring. Populations that had experienced the discipline, fear, and enforcement of his administration now confronted a landscape in which the immediacy of authority was replaced by uncertainty and negotiation. Villages, towns, and fortifications adjusted to the reduced presence of centralized control, while memories of the prior regime, its punishments, strategic displays, and calculated exercises of fear continued to influence behavior. Compliance, previously imposed through visible and often brutal enforcement, became contingent upon local interpretation of risk, loyalty, and opportunity, producing a complex tapestry of social interaction that reflected both historical memory and emergent autonomy. The early shaping of Vlad's legacy began in this period of quiet recalibration. Chroniclers, both within Wallachia and abroad, began to record accounts of his rule, emphasizing elements of severity, strategic acumen, and the pervasive use of fear as a tool of governance. These accounts, varying in detail, perspective, and reliability, contributed to a nascent narrative that positioned Vlad III as both a formidable leader and a figure of moral and psychological complexity. The subtle interplay of history, memory, and legend began to emerge. The actions of a ruler whose life had been marked by calculated brutality, precise enforcement, and enduring strategic awareness were gradually transmuted into stories that oscillated between admiration, horror, and intrigue. Reflecting the complex human response to extraordinary authority, geography and settlement patterns further shaped the perception of Vlad's impact. Fortresses, villages, and forests that had served as theaters for his campaigns and demonstrations of power now stood as silent witnesses to the previous regime, their physical presence reinforcing narratives of past authority while accommodating new governance. The rivers, hills, and valleys that had structured both military campaigns and administrative oversight retained the echoes of strategic projection, subtly influencing the decisions of those who moved through these spaces in the wake of Vlad's death. The landscape itself became a repository of memory, reflecting both practical considerations of security and the intangible imprint of psychological influence. Externally, foreign powers monitored and interpreted the posthumous developments with the same caution and deliberation that characterized their prior interactions with Vlad himself. Hungarian authorities, Ottoman representatives, and neighboring principalities assessed the implications of the void left by his passing, anticipating both opportunities and threats. The narrative of Wallachia's internal turbulence was communicated through diplomatic correspondence, travel reports, and the movement of emissaries, ensuring that the perception of authority, risk, and strategic potential extended beyond the immediate geographic confines of the principality. In this sense, Vlad's influence persisted indirectly, shaping decisions and calculations at both local and regional levels. Within the principality, patterns of compliance and resistance reflected the dual legacies of fear and respect that Vlad had cultivated. While his immediate presence was absent, the memory of swift, deliberate enforcement continued to influence social behavior, mediating the exercise of power by successors and local leaders. Boyars who had once been restrained by direct oversight now navigated a nuanced balance, integrating historical caution with contemporary ambition, producing a social equilibrium that was fragile, contingent, and deeply informed by the psychological imprint of prior authority. The emergent memory of Vlad III in these early years after his death was characterized by a subtle tension between historical fact and interpretive narrative. Chroniclers and observers selectively emphasized aspects of his life and reign, blending concrete events with moral, political, and symbolic interpretations. Reports of military campaigns, punitive measures, and administrative reforms coalesced with anecdotal accounts of personal ruthlessness, producing a layered memory that transcended immediate reality, shaping the perception of both contemporaries and subsequent generations. The result was a complex interplay of fact, interpretation, and legend, forming the foundational contours of what would later become the enduring mythos surrounding his name. The period following Vlad's death, therefore, can be understood as a liminal space in which authority, memory, and perception intersected. Wallachia navigated the immediate consequences of a leader's absence, negotiating between internal autonomy and external oversight, while simultaneously beginning the slow, accumulative process of myth-making that would transform lived events into enduring narrative. In this environment, the physical, political, and psychological traces of Vlad III's life converged, producing a landscape defined by both continuity and change, remembrance and adaptation, and the subtle negotiation of power in the absence of its central figure. In sum, Wallachia after Vlad III's death was a principality in transition. Boyars and local leaders adjusted to new conditions, external powers exerted influence with careful calculation, and the populace navigated the inherited legacy of authority, discipline, and fear. At the same time, the earliest iterations of Vlad's posthumous memory began to crystallize, blending fact, interpretation, and legend into a narrative that would shape both contemporary perception and historical memory. The principality itself, its people, and its neighbors remained attuned to the presence of the past, even in the quiet aftermath of absence, establishing a foundation for the enduring legacy of Vlad the Impaler in the broader cultural and historical consciousness. In the decades following Vlad III's death, the memory of his reign began to extend far beyond the physical borders of Wallachia, reaching into the broader cultural consciousness of Europe, carried primarily through the medium of printed pamphlets originating in German-speaking regions. These pamphlets, produced in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, reflected both the nascent power of print technology and the appetite of a European audience for accounts of moral, political, and military extremity. The German press, still in its early stages of influence, became a conduit through which stories of Vlad's severity, his strategic use of impalement, and the disciplined orchestration of fear were translated into narrative forms that emphasized horror, terror, and spectacle. The resulting texts, while grounded in kernels of historical truth, amplified and reconfigured events to create a figure whose presence extended far beyond Wallachian soil, entering the imaginations and anxieties of distant audiences. These pamphlets were not produced as neutral records, but as instruments of narrative framing, reflecting both the perspectives of their authors and the expectations of their readership. The German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire, in particular, were undergoing transformations in both literacy and cultural consumption. Printed material allowed for the rapid dissemination of stories that had previously circulated orally or in manuscript form. Within this context, Vlad III was transformed from a regional ruler, navigating the fragile politics of Wallachia, into an emblem of cruelty, moral extremity, and otherness, whose deeds were presented in stark, exaggerated terms designed to captivate, warn, and entertain simultaneously. The pamphlets emphasized the spectacular elements of his punishment strategies, often framing impalement, mass executions, and the orchestration of fear as emblematic of a singular, almost mythic cruelty, even as they occasionally acknowledged the political and military rationales that had motivated these actions. The visual and textual presentation of these pamphlets contributed significantly to the emerging perception of Vlad as a figure of terror. Woodcut illustrations, often stark and dramatic, depicted forests of impaled victims, fortified castles, and the figure of Vlad himself in imposing, sometimes grotesque form. Texts accompanied these images with narratives of moral and physical extremity, using hyperbole and moral framing to position Vlad as both a cautionary example and an object of fascination. Readers encountering these pamphlets in towns, markets, and private collections were offered a mediated version of history, in which the complexities of Wallachian politics, Ottoman pressures, and strategic necessity were often subordinated to the compelling drama of cruelty and power. The production of these German pamphlets was shaped not only by technological and cultural factors, but also by the political context of the late 15th century. European states, engaged in both diplomatic negotiation and ideological positioning in relation to the Ottoman Empire, found in Vlad III's story a useful figure around which moral, religious, and political narratives could be constructed. The pamphlets reflected concerns about tyranny, obedience, and the management of power, while simultaneously feeding the human fascination with the extremes of behavior. In this way, Vlad's life, recast through print, became a lens through which European readers could explore both ethical reflection and sensational intrigue, embedding his story into the cultural imagination far beyond the principality he had governed. The transformation of Vlad III into a figure of horror in these pamphlets also relied upon the selective amplification of specific incidents. Forests of the impaled, night attacks, and extreme punishments were recounted in ways that emphasized spectacle over context, producing a narrative rhythm that alternated between detailed description and dramatic interpretation. Each account, while grounded in the memory of historical events, was reshaped to create a continuous, immersive story in which the ruler's strategic calculation and political necessity were subsumed under the narrative of terror. The repetition and circulation of these accounts reinforced a collective perception, allowing the figure of Vlad to be both remembered and mythologized simultaneously. The readership for these pamphlets was broadening in scope, encompassing urban literate populations, members of the emerging bourgeois class, and individuals engaged in the intellectual and moral debates of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The dissemination of these stories across geographic and social boundaries facilitated the formation of a transnational perception of Vlad III, in which his deeds became symbolic of both fear and fascination, cruelty and order. The pamphlets functioned as cultural artifacts, encoding the anxieties, curiosities, and moral frameworks of the period, while simultaneously constructing a narrative persona that would endure in both historical and literary memory. Importantly, the pamphlets did not merely replicate history, but actively participated in its transformation. By emphasizing horror, spectacle, and moral extremity, they reshaped the narrative of Vlad's life from that of a complex political and military actor into a figure whose identity was inseparable from the psychological and cultural resonance of terror. European readers, encountering these texts, absorbed an image of Wallachia as both exotic and dangerous, a principality defined as much by the deeds of its ruler as by the political and geographic vulnerabilities that shaped his actions. In this process, Vlad III became a symbol whose presence extended well beyond his temporal or geographic reality, entering the imaginative space of European culture and literature. The birth of this mythos was gradual yet cumulative. Early pamphlets provided the narrative foundation, emphasizing dramatic events, moral framing, and psychological intensity. Subsequent reprints and adaptations, sometimes incorporating embellishments or reinterpretations, extended the reach and influence of these stories. The German press, through repetition, visual representation, and narrative amplification, transformed Vlad III into an archetype of cruelty whose historical specificity was increasingly merged with literary and cultural symbolism. In this sense, the pamphlets served both as historical record and imaginative construction, blending documentation, moral reflection, and narrative artistry into a durable representation of horror. The cultural and psychological impact of these texts cannot be overstated. Readers across Europe, encountering the story of Vlad the Impaler in vivid narrative and visual form, internalized a perception of terror that intertwined ethical reflection with fascination. The memory of forests of impaled victims, night raids, and systematic enforcement became embedded in European consciousness, creating a template through which extraordinary authority, strategic brutality, and moral extremity could be contemplated. In this way, the German pamphlets did not merely recount history, They constructed a framework for understanding, narrating, and ultimately mythologizing the figure of Vlad III, whose presence would resonate for centuries in both historical scholarship and popular imagination. Through the medium of early print, Vlad III transcended the boundaries of time, geography, and political context. His life, once confined to the complex, contingent realities of 15th-century Wallachia, became a symbol whose resonance extended into moral discourse, cultural imagination, and literary representation. The German pamphlets, by emphasizing horror, spectacle, and moral extremity, catalyzed the transformation of Vlad III from a regional ruler into a figure whose presence shaped both perception and narrative far beyond the borders of his principality. The slow, cumulative effect of these texts laid the foundation for the enduring legend that would evolve in subsequent centuries, blending historical fact, psychological insight, and imaginative interpretation into the cultural phenomenon now recognized as the myth of Dracula. While German pamphlets and other European narratives projected an image of Vlad III as a figure of terror and extraordinary cruelty, the memory of the same ruler in the lands of his birth took on an entirely different character, one that reflected the lived realities of Wallachia and the subtle interplay between governance, loyalty, and collective cultural consciousness. In Romanian folk memory, Vlad was remembered not solely as a figure of extreme violence, but as a strict, deliberate, and remarkably capable leader whose primary concern had been the defense of his homeland against external encroachment and internal disorder. This alternative perception, transmitted orally across generations, developed into a nuanced folkloric duality, presenting Vlad simultaneously as a stern enforcer and a protector, a ruler whose fearsome methods were framed within a moral and practical context recognizable to those who had experienced or inherited the memory of his administration. The rural and localized context of Wallachian life shaped the contours of this folk memory. Villages, fortified towns, and strategic passes that had been directly affected by Vlad's campaigns and governance became loci for storytelling, reflection, and transmission of his deeds. Oral narratives emphasized both the severity of his punishments and the underlying rationale that framed them as measures of justice, deterrence, and the consolidation of order. In these accounts, forests of impaled enemies, previously sensationalized in European pamphlets, were sometimes recalled not merely for their horror, but for their intended effect in maintaining the security of the principality and protecting ordinary villagers from disorder, pillage, or betrayal. Such narratives highlighted the practical, moral, and protective dimensions of Vlad's actions, presenting him as a figure whose severity was integrally connected to responsibility and the defense of the land. The interplay of fear and respect was central to the development of this folk memory. Whereas European accounts emphasized terror for its own narrative effect, local recollection framed fear as a functional component of governance. Villagers and local leaders understood the necessity of strict enforcement, the significance of strategic deterrence, and the consequences of defiance in a principality constantly vulnerable to Ottoman incursions and internal factionalism. Within this context, Vlad's brutal methods were interpreted less as indiscriminate cruelty, and more as the extension of authority designed to preserve social and political stability. The moral dimension of his rule, ensuring that loyalty, law, and survival were maintained, was emphasized alongside the physical demonstrations of force, producing a balanced recollection that combined awe, respect, and understanding. The oral transmission of Vlad's memory also incorporated narrative techniques, allegory, and storytelling conventions endemic to Romanian culture. Tales of his life and deeds were often structured to illustrate ethical lessons, communal values, and the consequences of both obedience and rebellion. Within these narratives, Vlad's actions were contextualized, impalements were framed as deterrence against betrayal, taxation enforcement was portrayed as necessary for the sustenance of the principality, and strategic cruelty was presented as a measured response to external threats. The rhythm, cadence, and repetition of these stories reinforced their psychological impact while embedding moral reflection within the framework of historical memory. In this way, the folk narratives transformed the raw events of Vlad's life into lessons, parables, and cultural touchstones, creating a persistent and reflective understanding of leadership that emphasized both efficacy and morality. The role of local geography in shaping these narratives was also significant. Villages situated near forests, rivers, or hilltop fortresses that had been central to Vlad's campaigns often became the settings of specific stories where memory intertwined with physical markers of the past. Paths, rivers, and ruins acted as mnemonic devices, enabling narrators and listeners alike to situate stories in recognizable spaces and to connect abstract ethical lessons with tangible environments. This interaction between memory and landscape reinforced the continuity of cultural perception, allowing successive generations to internalize both the practical and moral dimensions of Vlad's rule within the familiar rhythms of everyday life. The duality in Romanian folk memory, Vlad as both strict enforcer and protector, was further reinforced by the persistence of communal experience. Families, elders, and local leaders passed down tales that emphasized protection of the land and the community alongside the consequences of disorder. The collective recollection emphasized continuity, highlighting Vlad's role in resisting external domination, maintaining internal discipline, and ensuring that social cohesion and security were preserved. In these stories, fear was instrumental rather than arbitrary, punishment was deliberate rather than capricious, and the ruler's authority was intimately connected to the well-being of the principality. At the same time, folk memory did not entirely suppress the elements of dread associated with Vlad's methods. Rather, these elements were integrated into a broader moral and practical framework, emphasizing that the ruler's severity, while sometimes extreme, was ultimately a function of duty, vigilance, and responsibility. Tales recounted the consequences of treachery or defiance in ways that reinforced ethical norms, social cohesion, and awareness of the political realities facing Wallachia. Vlad's image as an enforcer of order therefore coexisted with his image as a protector, producing a layered, reflective, and internally coherent understanding of leadership. This duality in perception had enduring cultural and historical implications. Romanian narratives preserved a sense of historical realism while simultaneously allowing for interpretive flexibility, enabling successive generations to reconcile the severity of Vlad's actions with the moral and practical exigencies of his rule. In doing so, the folk memory constructed a distinct framework for evaluating leadership, power, and justice, one that differed from the European literary and pamphlet tradition by emphasizing the lived realities of governance, communal survival, and the intricate balance between discipline and protection. The subtle interplay between fear, respect, and moral justification in Romanian memory also contributed to the eventual divergence between historical reality and European myth. While foreign pamphlets emphasized sensational cruelty, local accounts emphasized measured enforcement within a strategic and ethical framework. This divergence created a foundation for later reinterpretations, allowing Vlad III to be remembered both as a historical actor and as a folkloric symbol whose life and actions could be narrated in multiple contextually coherent ways. In essence, Romanian folk memory of Vlad III illustrates the complexity of historical perception when mediated through lived experience, communal narrative, and localized cultural frameworks. It emphasizes that historical figures are remembered not merely through the events they enact, but through the interplay between action, perception, and interpretation. Vlad's legacy in Wallachia was thus neither wholly heroic nor wholly terrifying. It was a synthesis of authority, justice, and moral intent, preserved in stories that conveyed both caution and admiration, fear and respect, cruelty and protection. By framing Vlad III as a strict but fair ruler defending his land, Romanian tradition established a counter-narrative to the pan-European depictions of horror, ensuring that his memory remained nuanced, contextually grounded, and morally instructive. This duality, balancing fear with justice and terror with protection, shaped the contours of cultural memory for centuries, providing a complex and enduring lens through which Vlad's life, rule, and methods could be understood within the landscape that he had governed so relentlessly. The enduring legend of Vlad III, shaped over centuries by the interplay of historical record, folk memory, and European sensationalism, would ultimately undergo one of its most profound transformations in the late 19th century, with the publication of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula in 1897. Stoker, an Irish author with a meticulous but incomplete engagement with historical research, encountered the name Dracula through a combination of travel notes, prior folklore collections, and historical references that had already begun to circulate in Western Europe. The process by which the Wallachian prince became the fictional vampire immortalized in Gothic literature was not a straightforward one, but rather the result of a complex interweaving of fact, exaggeration, partial knowledge, and imaginative projection, filtered through the cultural lens of Victorian anxieties, moral sensibilities, and fascination with the exotic. Stoker's exposure to the historical figure of Vlad III was indirect and mediated. He relied upon various sources including scholarly compilations, historical pamphlets, and travel accounts describing the lands of the Carpathians and the Ottoman frontier. Many of these sources, particularly the German pamphlets of the 15th and 16th centuries, emphasized extreme cruelty and terror, presenting a distorted or exaggerated image of the prince's methods, particularly the practice of impalement. The gap between actual historical records which portrayed Vlad as a politically astute but brutal ruler responding to the exigencies of a volatile principality, and the dramatic, sensational accounts circulating in Europe, provided fertile ground for Stoker's imagination. In encountering these narratives, Stoker did not merely absorb historical fact but also internalized a European perception of Vlad as a figure whose name was inseparable from horror, violence, and uncanny authority. The process of transformation from historical figure to fictional vampire was also shaped by Stoker's engagement with folklore and Gothic conventions. The novel's narrative structure, its emphasis on suspense, dread, and the supernatural, and its Victorian cultural context demanded a figure whose menace could operate both symbolically and literally. Vlad III, with his historical associations of fear, extreme punishment, and legendary cruelty, provided a symbolic foundation onto which Stoker could project traits of the supernatural vampire. The historical record, fragmented and mediated, left room for the insertion of Gothic imagination, turning a politically motivated prince into a creature of night, immortality, and moral transgression. The etymology of the name Dracula played a subtle but important role in this transformation. Derived from the Romanian Dracula, meaning son of Dracula, the name carried connotations of both familial lineage and symbolic resonance with the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society to which Vlad II Dracula had belonged. For Stoker, encountering the name within historical and geographical texts imbued it with a sense of authenticity, exoticism, and a latent aura of danger. While the author did not fully engage with the precise historical context or the nuances of Wallachian politics, the name itself functioned as a bridge between historical fact and literary invention, offering a linguistic and cultural anchor around which Gothic narrative could be constructed. Historical misunderstandings and gaps in research further facilitated the reinvention of Vlad III. Stoker had access to secondary and tertiary sources, many of which conflated fact and folklore, misrepresented chronology, or emphasized elements most conducive to sensational narrative. The cumulative effect of these errors, omissions, and exaggerations was the creation of a semi-mythical figure whose historical reality, his governance, military strategy, and political acumen was largely subsumed under the imaginative requirements of horror fiction. In this process, the Wallachian prince's historical acts of territorial defense, political negotiation, and administrative control were filtered through a lens of European fascination with cruelty, otherness, and Gothic moral ambiguity. producing a character whose terror operated as both literary device and symbolic reflection of cultural anxieties. Stoker's construction of Dracula also relied upon the geographical and cultural framing of Eastern Europe as remote, exotic, and perilous. The Carpathian Mountains, dense forests, and fortified towns of Wallachia became narrative devices, producing atmosphere, tension, and a sense of isolation central to Gothic storytelling. Vlad's historical campaigns, often designed to navigate precisely these landscapes, were abstracted into symbolic and terrifying elements within the novel. Forests of impaled enemies became generalized imagery of horror, night raids transformed into stalking predation, and the strategic projection of fear became the supernatural predilections of an immortal vampire. Geography, history, and imagination intertwined, producing a compelling, immersive, and psychologically resonant narrative landscape. The result of Stoker's synthesis of sources, imagination, and Gothic convention was a profound recontextualization of Vlad III, where Wallachian folk memory had emphasized his role as a strict but just ruler, and German pamphlets had sensationalized his cruelty. Stoker's novel fused these threads into a new literary identity. Dracula became an archetype of the Gothic vampire, a figure capable of both human and supernatural terror, whose historical inspiration provided gravitas, exotic authenticity, and symbolic resonance. The transformation illustrates the interplay of historical fact, folkloric memory, and literary invention, demonstrating how partial knowledge, imaginative interpretation, and cultural context can converge to produce a figure of enduring fascination. The historical gaps that facilitated this reinvention also highlight the selective processes inherent in myth-making. Stoker emphasized particular aspects of Vlad's legacy, cruelty, foreignness, and symbolic menace, while downplaying or ignoring the political, administrative, and protective dimensions that characterized his actual rule. The temporal distance mediated through centuries of print, oral memory, and fragmented documentation allowed for the selective amplification of certain traits and the omission of others, producing a narrative in which historical specificity yielded to symbolic resonance. The result is a figure who simultaneously reflects and obscures the historical reality of Wallachia, demonstrating the ways in which literature, memory, and cultural perception can reshape the past. Ultimately, Bram Stoker's Dracula stands as a testament to the enduring capacity of history to inspire imagination. The Wallachian prince's life, already layered with complexity through European pamphlets, Ottoman chronicles, and Romanian folk memory, became a foundation for Gothic creation, enabling the projection of fear, moral contemplation, and narrative suspense into the cultural consciousness of the Victorian era and beyond. Vlad III, once a temporal actor navigating the precarious politics of a turbulent principality, was reconstituted as a literary icon whose name, deeds, and aura continue to captivate readers, scholars, and audiences worldwide. The transformation from historical prince to fictional vampire underscores the interplay between fact and fiction, memory and imagination, and political reality and cultural myth. While the historical Vlad III had been defined by precise strategies of governance, military acumen, and territorial defense, Stoker's Dracula exists primarily within the symbolic and imaginative domain, blending traces of history with Gothic invention. This reinvention exemplifies the process by which individual lives are transmuted into mythic forms, demonstrating how selective perception, narrative mediation, and literary creativity can extend the influence of a historical figure far beyond the temporal and geographic limits of their existence. In this slow, reflective view, the story of Vlad III's transformation into Dracula is not abrupt or purely fantastical, but the cumulative result of centuries of mediated memory, cross-cultural interpretation, and narrative reconstruction. It is a process in which historical fact, folk perception, European sensationalism, and Victorian Gothic imagination converge, producing a figure whose resonance is both historically grounded and culturally transcendent. The narrative of Dracula, in its depth, persistence, and cultural ubiquity, thus represents the final stage of a centuries-long evolution, wherein a Wallachian prince's life, marked by strategy, discipline, and deliberate severity, was reinterpreted, magnified, and mythologized into one of the most enduring icons of horror literature. The story of Vlad III, as it unfolds across the centuries, is neither linear nor confined to a single perspective, but instead emerges as a layered interplay of history, memory, perception, and imagination. From the quiet dawn of 15th century Wallachia, where the geography of mountains, forests, and rivers framed the formative years of a prince, to the intricate political negotiations that defined his ascensions to power, Vlad's life was shaped by the exigencies of survival, governance, and defense against external and internal threats. Every strategic decision, act of administration, and methodical enforcement contributed to a legacy that was simultaneously practical, psychological, and moral. Yet, as his life receded into history, each subsequent retelling, reinterpretation, and embellishment began to subtly transform the essence of the man into a figure of legend. The boundary between historical reality and the mythic character that would endure in culture gradually blurred, shaped by the slow accumulation of narrative layers, each adding perspective, interpretation, and occasionally distortion. The initial historical foundation of Vlad III's life is marked by the intricate dynamics of Wallachian politics. The principality, situated between the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, was a space of fragile allegiances, internal factionalism, and relentless external pressures. Vlad's governance was characterized by calculated severity, an integration of psychological insight with strategic enforcement, and a deliberate use of fear to consolidate authority, deter rebellion, and protect the land from external domination. Acts such as the implementation of taxation, anti-corruption measures, and strict enforcement of legal norms were intertwined with brutal punishments, most notoriously Impalement, which served both as instrument and symbol of authority. To contemporaries, these measures were as much about survival and order as about cruelty. To distant observers, they became the foundation for tales of horror that emphasized spectacle over context. The subsequent amplification of Vlad's deeds through German pamphlets and other early European publications exemplifies the ways in which mediated narratives can alter perception. In these texts, distributed across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, the measured strategies, political calculation, and moral reasoning behind Vlad's actions were frequently overshadowed by sensationalized accounts of impalement, mass executions, and terrifying displays of authority. The selective emphasis on horror, the visual dramatization in woodcuts, and the moral framing of the texts allowed European audiences to encounter a version of Vlad III who existed primarily as a figure of fear, a man whose identity was inseparable from cruelty and terror. Yet, even as these accounts exaggerated aspects of his rule, they simultaneously preserved the memory of a figure whose presence had been both tangible and psychologically significant, demonstrating the capacity of narrative to preserve essence while transforming perception. Within Wallachia itself, a parallel yet distinct memory evolved through oral tradition, folklore, and local storytelling. Romanian recollections emphasized Vlad's role as a protector and enforcer of justice, highlighting the defensive, political, and moral rationales for his strict methods. In villages, towns, and fortified settlements, the memory of forests, fortresses, and borders became intertwined with the stories of a ruler whose severity was understood as a form of ethical and practical governance. This duality, strict enforcer and protector of the land, produced a nuanced cultural memory that coexisted with, and occasionally resisted, the horror-driven narratives circulating in Western Europe. Within these folk memories, fear was instrumental, punishment purposeful, and authority closely linked to communal security, illustrating the complex interplay between perception, lived experience, and the moral framing of historical action. The gradual evolution of Vlad's image into the literary figure of Dracula represents another layer in the ongoing transformation from man to myth. Bram Stoker's engagement with historical sources, folklore, and Gothic conventions combined fragmented knowledge, imaginative interpretation, and narrative creativity to produce a figure who was at once historical and supernatural, human and monstrous. In the novel, Vlad's historical reputation for cruelty, his name, and the remote, mysterious geography of Wallachia were merged with Victorian anxieties, narrative suspense, and Gothic tropes to create an enduring archetype of the vampire. Stoker's fictionalization further complicated the relationship between fact and legend, demonstrating how selective interpretation, cultural imagination, and narrative necessity can transform a historical figure into a symbol whose resonance extends far beyond temporal or geographic constraints. Throughout these centuries, the interplay of brutality, political necessity, memory, and imagination created a layered cultural artifact in which the historical Vlad III and the legendary Dracula coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in parallel. Each retelling, whether in the careful chronicles of Ottoman or Hungarian observers, the sensational pamphlets of German printers, the folk stories preserved in Romanian villages, or the literary imaginings of 19th-century authors, contributed to a gradual sedimentation of myth atop fact. The historical man, a prince navigating survival and governance in a precarious principality, became inseparable from the monstrous figure of folklore, moral narrative, and Gothic fiction, illustrating the capacity of human memory and cultural transmission to transform reality into enduring narrative form. This process also reflects the broader dynamics of historical perception. Authority, cruelty, and leadership are interpreted not only through action but through the lenses of witness, storyteller, and audience. The psychological impact of fear, the aesthetic effect of horror, and the moral interpretation of power all shape the ways in which historical figures are remembered. In Vlad III's case, the very tools he employed, impalement, rigorous discipline, strategic projection of authority, became both literal historical events and symbolic touchstones for subsequent cultural interpretation. The line between the man, the ruler, and the myth became progressively indistinct, producing a figure whose life could be recounted, analyzed, and reimagined in a variety of contexts, each layering new meaning atop the old. Even as centuries passed, the resonance of Vlad's life and legend continued to evolve. Folklore maintained ethical and communal interpretations of his rule. European pamphlets preserved the dramatic horror of his methods, and literature transformed him into a timeless emblem of fear and fascination. The resulting figure is simultaneously historical and mythical, a composite constructed from observable events, mediated accounts, cultural imagination, and literary invention. This convergence underscores the complexity of memory, the malleability of narrative, and the capacity for human societies to create symbols that operate simultaneously as reflections of historical reality and as repositories of cultural meaning. In contemplating Vlad III's transformation from a Wallachian prince into the legendary Dracula, one observes not simply the story of a singular ruler, but the intricate processes by which history, memory, and imagination intersect. War, political instability, and administrative brutality formed the factual foundation. Propaganda, chronicling, and sensational storytelling shaped perception. Oral tradition preserved ethical interpretation and local memory, and literature reimagined the figure for a broader cultural consciousness. Each layer contributed to the ongoing dialogue between reality and myth, demonstrating that the creation of legend is rarely abrupt, but instead emerges slowly through cumulative processes that blend fact, interpretation, and imagination. The blurring line between myth and man, therefore, is both inevitable and illuminating. Vlad III's life demonstrates that historical actors are not remembered solely for the deeds they perform, but for the ways in which those deeds are mediated, interpreted, and transmitted across time and space. The interplay of violence, governance, propaganda, folklore, and literature produces enduring symbols that transcend the immediacy of human action, illustrating how memory, narrative, and imagination transform the finite contours of a life into a figure whose presence continues to shape perception, culture, and imagination centuries later. In the end, the story of Vlad the Impaler, is a testament to the intertwined forces of history and myth, brutality and narrative, survival and imagination. A man who once navigated the perils of 15th century Wallachia with calculation, discipline, and unyielding authority, became, over centuries, a legendary figure whose identity occupies the liminal space between fact and fiction, ruler and monster, history and imagination. The forests of impaled enemies, the campaigns to defend a precarious principality, the strategies of psychological control, and the subsequent European retellings all coalesce into a slow, deliberate narrative in which human actions are reinterpreted across generations, creating a figure whose resonance endures, timeless, spectral, and profoundly compelling. Thus, Vlad III stands simultaneously as a historical man and a cultural symbol, embodying the profound interplay of human ambition, cruelty, defense, memory, and imagination. The boundaries between Vlad the ruler, Vlad the historical actor, and Dracula the mythic vampire dissolve, leaving a figure whose presence inhabits the space between reality and legend, a figure whose story is at once a chronicle of the past and a reflection on the processes by which humans remember, interpret, and ultimately mythologize the extraordinary.